Oh boy. I'm excited for today. I have recorded a whole bunch of fun stuff. And it's going to be broken up into 2 episodes now. That wasn't my original intention. But the creation of this went on for so long that it was a necessity. And I'm so fired up to talk about some nice people that just practiced really hard on their guitars and made some of their dreams come true today. After the 8.5 hours of the previous long episode of Audio Slave, Chris Cornell, Guns N' Roses, Faith No More, Metallica kind of stuff with all the riots and the lawsuits and backstabbing and the, drug overdoses and harassment, broken bones and such, spaghetti incidents and whatnot, and the vanishing points and the car smashings. But now we're going to finish up Crossroads, the film, with in-depth talk about the construction of the climactic scene, musically and staging-wise, what went into the performance, what went into the recording and music, and who put it all together, because it's more than a couple of fellas. There's going to be a lot of shop talk. There's going to be a lot of talk about the history of shred guitar in terms of playing, but also in terms of the construction of instruments and the components of those instruments. I learned a million more reasons to admire Steve Vai while researching these episodes. I'm also going to do something I haven't done before on a single episode of the history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll, and that is I'm going to tag in 2 friends this time. I've obviously tagged in my friend Joe Moore for the Halloween episode about horror movies and the Misfits, and this time I had no shred cred, so I brought in Brian and Dan, who you will hear from via live recordings of us in my living room on a night when we started cracking open a ton of old guitar magazines Brian brought over, and I tried to keep the fellas on task in conversation while we started getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 White Claws deep. And we don't just touch on what we see at the time. I'm going to refer back to those because Brian decided he didn't want those magazines anymore, and I needed them. I found stuff going back to 1990, and info about Steve Vai and when he was in Whitesnake and David Lee Roth's band, besides his solo stuff. The idea that he had such a presence, I was not aware of this. He had such a presence on the scene, as it were, the scene of instrumental guitar hero thingly-doodlies, comings and goings, well before he released Passion and Warfare. I of course, first became aware of him as in the 90s as like a soundtrack artist and a solo artist. People were like, oh, you like rock music, you like guitar solo-y stuff, well, you got to hear Steve Vai, he's amazing, he's like the best ever. And I will qualify, as I always do, qualify my biases when it comes to the subject I'm talking about here. Steve Vai has never really got me in his musical clutches the way he does other people that really, admire what he does and listen to him a lot. I admire him enough to have gone to see him play live back on the second G3 tour. I really enjoyed it. I enjoy seeing footage of him playing. There's something about the production style and the arrangement style and the way that he layers instruments on his own stuff that I have to admit I'm not a huge fan of. I get why it's awesome. It's very orchestrated sounding to me, and I think Brian May of Queen is as far as I go with that sort of guitar orchestration mentality or concept. And when you're doubling melodies with a synth player, I'm kind of out. I can't dig it, but I like playing guitar through crummier synth pedals for some reason. And I like Deep Purple. What are you going to do? All that is to say, if you are here because you know everything there is to know about Steve Vai and the history of shred guitar and you want to see if you're going to learn anything, you're probably not. Sorry. If you're here because you love rock guitar and you want to learn about a patch of the history that you maybe didn't get when it was happening, or you were too young when it was happening, you weren't born when it was happening, or you always sort of blew it off, or you didn't know how deep the history actually went and how complex it is, I certainly didn't, then congratulations, you're probably going to learn some stuff. If you just got nothing else to listen to and you know everything about shred guitar anyway, and you might as well just give my podcast a try, I appreciate you being here. I will also say I'm a bigger Zappa fan than I am a Vai fan. I'm a bigger Zappa fan than I am pretty much any other known for playing electric guitar instrumentally and making his career happen that way kind of an artist. Even I became a Jeff Beck fan because of the Yardbirds. I'm one of those dirtbags. So now that I've thoroughly debunked any notion that I might be an expert in this, I'll tell you, I'm also drawing from a book by Greg Prato called Shredders, The Oral History of Speed Guitar and More, which came out very recently compared to the other books that I've been reading for these podcast episodes. And holy smokes, is it amazing. It is just a fantastic resource. It's so good to hear the stories as told by the people that built this whole genre up through the 80s and beyond. One that started in the 70s, yes. But the folks that were there making it happen, I'm very excited to sort of bring that into one of my episodes and really learn a lot of stuff. Now, I will also probably have to warn you that for the first time in an episode of the history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll, I'm going to be dipping into live interview stuff more so than I did on my Halloween episode, which was pretty short. It was only a few minutes with my buddy Joe Moore talking about horror movie stuff. This is going to feature two very, very knowledgeable goofballs that I love and admire a lot in my own musical life. Brian Timpey and Dan Tyson. They both have musical qualifications above and beyond anyone else that I associate with on a regular basis. Dan went to GIT in the mid-90s, came out of it to find that there was nothing left of the shred guitar wasteland in a professional sense of the word. And then Brian went to the University of Washington and completed his musical education there. Both of them went on to work at Microsoft. They both took their music degrees and worked at Microsoft, which is what you do up here in the Northwest when you are someone with a music degree. Or you marry someone that works at Microsoft or Amazon. Even if you stick with the music, obviously, in the hopes that you're going to make something happen professionally. The van costs money. The gear costs money. The rental of a rehearsal space costs money. You don't get that fresh out of music school with any kind of job that qualifies you for. So I will probably duck into the conversation that I had with them in at least two different segments, if not break it up into three. We'll see how it goes. So we're going to talk the Crossroads movie. We're going to talk the history of Steve Vai. We're going to talk the history of shred guitar. And before I get started on any of it, I'll take a nice big swallow of Farmer McPringle's organic radish water. Yum, yum. That's right. I start every podcast recording and every morning and every workout with organic radish water from Farmer McPringle's pressing plant. Sign up today with the link in my description for a monthly delivery of pressed radish water and get a bonus packet of instant celery shake for all the celery-based proteins that you need to get you through the day. Use code History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll to get 3% off your first monthly delivery. And one final note before I get into the deeper content. For this episode, I'm in a funny little place as far as what I might choose to do with music. I haven't made a decision yet, but regular listeners to the show know that I basically use the recordings here as a dumping ground for a ton of guitar demos recorded in my living room at various times that I may or may not have then welded into other guitar parts to create songs with for some of the band I'm in. And I do this for atmosphere. I do it for effect. I do it to break things up for your ears to sort of perk up every now and then so you don't get too bogged down with my droning voice and then realize you've been driving for 40 minutes and you didn't hear a single thing I said. It's all guitar oriented generally. And today for this kind of audience, I'm just going to let you all know and come clean. I am not a great lead guitar player. I'm not a very good technical guitarist or musician in most senses. So there's absolutely nothing I can do to impress any of you listening with the kind of playing that that comes out of me on a regular basis. And to suddenly bear down with a metronome and a bunch of charts and try to force myself to come up with something that might be impressive is probably going to be the least impressive thing you will have ever heard, because that will just sound like pandering and very clumsy, bad pandering. There's nothing I can play that's going to knock your socks off if you're a fan of Steve Vai and shred guitar. Because I play with feel, man, which means I don't bend notes in tune very well, man. All right, let's get on with it. Woo!
Oh, we are going. So,
no way to have to pee.
well, let me start. So the way I would frame this is I want to set my premise and let you guys tell me if how far off I am or how wrong I am.
Fair enough. I'm good at that.
We just got done about talking about Aussie guitarists and the whole Randy Rhoads secret audition that he didn't know who he was auditioning for, which got you guys talking about like 7 other guitar players from that era, which is exactly what I want to kind of record here. But to set this up, the breakthrough I had when I was young was like, okay, got into thrash metal when I was in mid-teens. I heard Metallica, Anthrax, Slayer, and Megadeth. What are you looking at? Oh, we're looking at Guitar Magazine. Sorry.
Wow, Carvin mixer.
A Carvin board.
Wow.
We're looking at early 90s, late 80s Guitar World
90s?
magazine.
This is
90.
Guitar for the Practicing Musician, November 1990.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's the December Christmas issue with like, who's on the cover? Tell everyone who's on the cover.
Everybody.
Steve Vai, Satriani, Skid Row,
Jeff Beck. Reb
Beach.
Alex Skolnick. No, that's not Alex Skolnick.
That's Alex
That's
Skolnick.
Alex Skolnick. I don't know who that is, actually.
Yeah, I have no idea who that is.
Stu Hamm, Gary Moore, Blue Saraceno.
Yeah, Blues.
And Alex
Alex
Skolnick.
Skolnick, yep, with his fucking Ibanez.
Yep.
That I had a blue one of, as we talked about earlier, but mine had the single coil humbucker.
Yeah, the hum single hum.
And Dan, you graduated from the GIT in 94?
Yes, 94. Exactly the wrong time to graduate from GIT.
And then moved to Seattle.
Nobody gave 2 shits about playing a lot of notes.
Exactly. And then Brian, your musical higher education?
University of Washington.
Got it. So what I was trying to figure out when I was younger was like, why does this Slayer sound so different than Megadeth, Anthrax, and Metallica? And I didn't know for 5 years until I heard Venom's Welcome to Hell and Judas Priest's Unleashed in the East. And when I heard those 2 albums, I'm like, oh, that's the extra evil and dissonance and chromaticism that makes Slayer sound Slayer.
Yeah.
Not like the other bands. Now, when I listened to, I didn't get super into Vai and Satriani and guys like that, but I knew they had something different from all of the guys that were hotshot guitar players that always would cite Van Halen, Jimi Hendrix, and maybe a little Ritchie Blackmore, right? There was Malmsteen, who was obviously Blackmore plus Paganini. I could figure that out. But when it came to them, I'm like, where does this extra shit come from? There's the Malmsteen. Yes. This is Dan Tyson. This is exactly what we need. Keep going.
You had a...
I still have. I have 2.
Oh,
I want that guitar.
That's a Knight Swan. That's a Kramer Knight Swan.
That Vivian Campbell is holding?
Yes,
in this
and they just started reissuing them.
You're kidding.
And I want one so bad.
Dude, do they have one with the lightning bolts
Yes,
on it?
it's that guitar.
Is it really?
It's Kramer. It's Kramer. It's reverse headstock, the whole thing with the lightning. And they have the spots. They have the one with the spots, too.
Why would you tell me
both
this?
Knight Swans.
I'm going to order one of these
Dude,
tonight when I get home.
I know. I want to play it at NAMM. I want to see it. I want to, I keep waiting. It's been out. I think it's been like a year. But, yeah, I want the next one. Anyway.
Dude.
that was awesome, by the way. So that's the Malmsteen. And I jacked up the gain on this, so you're actually louder than you were. So this is good. It's good.
Dude.
But we can still talk over it. Brian is just looking at ads in guitar magazines now.
Dude.
Porno graffiti.
Nuno with before the N4 guitar.
And he's got the wholehearted acoustic.
Yeah.
With a Florentine cutaway.
Wow,
Washburn.
that 12-string from that's the 12-string from
Wholehearted video.
Wholehearted, yep.
Yeah.
That's
I
it.
just said that. God damn it.
Did you say Wholehearted? I didn't hear you say
How
it.
did I beat you to it?
Yeah.
I'm very drunk.
We were drinking White Claws. So the end of that whole
Courtney trap.
That whole premise was why do Vai and Satch sound different? And even though I kind of knew a little, I knew some Zappa, then I heard Jeff Beck's Blow by Blow and Wired.
Oh, okay.
Then that in my mind, logistically, I was like, okay, that's the Venom and like early Judas Priest element that makes Vai and Satch not like a Van Halen, not like a Randy Rhoads, not like anyone in the 80s that was playing bluesy hard rock licks that didn't have a ton of like crazy surprises. But tell me if I'm totally off base.
Well, it's something about that though. The other reason why those two sound so much similar is because fucking Vai took lessons from Satriani.
Zappa. Or Satriani, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean
clearly influenced.
Yeah, I mean, but Vai's singular. To me, Vai is so unique. Like Vai is so unique in the guitar player universe because of the Zappa influence. Which, if you listen to Zappa first and then you hear Steve Vai playing, you're like, oh, clearly he wanted to be he wanted to be in Frank Zappa's band, right?
Yes.
Like all that wacky stuff. Because I heard post Zappa Vi first.
Sure.
And then I heard
mean,
Zappa.
everybody, everybody did.
Flexible.
I heard David Lee Roth first.
Oh,
I heard Vi with.
okay.
Well, I mean, I heard Crossroads. I saw the movie first.
Yeah, okay.
Which
And
is,
then
by the
David
way,
Lee Roth.
what I'm recording this for. I'm
Over the
recording
movie?
this for a Crossroads episode.
Oh well,
Nice.
here, pardon me.
So turn this, turn the volume back up. Yeah, I should give you the fucking headphones.
Thank you for headphones, Jay. Whatever, Steve Vai. Whatever, Ralph Macchio.
Let's do a quick test. If you really want to know if this episode is worth you listening to it, because you might know too many things about this topic or these artists already, and you might not learn anything at all, I will do a quick snippet here. This is the kind of thing that I want to talk about. These little details about Steve Vai's work from a Guitar Player magazine from May 1990, where he is taking the interviewer through, I believe, every single track on Passion and Warfare. And I want to read you directly from his quotes about the recording and creation of the song The Riddle. Interviewer Mr. Joe Gore says, "More E. Lydian. From the very first notes, you set up an incredible tension between the A sharp and the B." Vai says, "I know, I love that. I wrote just those first few notes with the A sharp and the B over an E major triad when I was 15 or 16. Gore says, "The bass sits on an E almost all the way through the tune, but you superimpose about a dozen different modes over it. I love that approach, although you're not likely to hear it on the radio. It goes through Lydian, major, synthetic notes, flat sevens, whole tone stuff, and there are parts where it goes off into space. But Riddle is all melody. I tried to play fast in places, but nothing worked. I was compelled to play these melodies. It was really special to hear these things, put them on tape, then listen back and go, this is one of my favorite pieces on the record. Sure, some people say they're never satisfied with what they do. I used to be like that, but I'm tired of being miserable. So I say, I've tried my best. I'm going to enjoy it now. It's not worth it to walk around saying, I hate everything I do. That's bullshit." Now, don't you love that? I think every artist needs to hear stuff like that from someone who's so deep into the note choices and, how he constructs what he does and how he challenges himself. But that's not the reason why I wanted to read you this passage about the riddle. The next part is. Gore asks, "How did you get that incredible orgasm note during the sex passage?" "I don't know, it just happened. It works really good with that scream, which is, well, I don't know if you want to print this, but when I got my first 4-track recorder, I used to record everything. I had this cat who was always in heat. She'd walk around with her butt in the air, waiting for someone to come along and pooch her. We called up the vet and said, 'What can we do? She's tearing up the furniture and it's embarrassing.' He said, 'You're really not going to want to print this.' To relieve her with a thermometer. I wasn't about to do it, but my roommate did. The cat went, "Rawr!" And I recorded it, and I later put it on a sampler and played it backwards at a different speed. I put that on there because that's what the section is about. What about the little stereo guitars panned left and right? That's a BC Rich double neck 12 string recorded dry through a Mutron biphase foot pedal. Let's get a bit into the Shrapnel Records narrative with some quotes from Mike Varney from the book Shredders, The Oral History of Speed Guitar and More by Greg Prato. Mike says, I was sitting around at the end of the 70s and I was getting frustrated because I was a big guitar fan and disco music and punk rock and all this stuff was kind of dummying down the virtuoso stuff. People like Al Di Meola, Uli Roth, Michael Schenker, and Eddie Van Halen. There was just like a lull around 1980 or so. And to me, your narrator, not Mike Varney, this is one of those missing pieces of the timeline that was never there in my brain. I never really understood what was the cutoff between the old guard and the post Van Halen, or let's say the Randy Rhoads, early 80s sort of shred obsession, right? I guess in my mind, it's Randy Rhoads plus Yngwie Malmsteen. And this fills that in. This is that, oh, okay, this is what was preventing maybe guitar virtuoso music from really taking off during that late 70s, early 80s time. That's what the public was into. They'd been blown away by Van Halen, but nobody had yet recovered from a high-energy rock and roll guitar playing standpoint from Van Halen. You know, lots of times people will cite a certain high point in an era of entertainment as the peak of that era, or that peak of that kind of entertainment. And it's been pointed out to me by other people that were those times really the peak, or were those times just the times you couldn't recover from? And were they instead the eras that killed that genre? I don't care if you're talking about like American comedy sitcoms. I don't care if you're talking about a certain genre of dance music. I don't care if you're talking about the history of freak shows or carnivals or vaudeville. There's always a peak that everyone says, this is when it was really doing great. But then, as Eddie Van Halen himself has pointed out in interviews, there's that time when everything has to, like, it gets too bloated and it gets too oversaturated, and then it boils back down to the basics and starts all over again. And those are the times he said he's really interested in paying more attention to what's going to happen next. But there's some that a whole genre gets killed because of that. From my incredibly biased perspective as a thrash metal fan, and I'm a late coming thrash metal fan, that was like Clash of the Titans in 1991. Megadeth, Anthrax, Slayer playing Madison Square Garden while Metallica is playing arenas on their own. Yeah, that was a high point for thrash metal, but that was the point where it all had to get more commercial and sort of dumb itself down for a while to continue after that brush with the mainstream. Like, they got a little taste of it and Metallica capitalized on it, and then everyone else tried to follow suit to varying degrees of mostly success in some cases. I was going to say mostly failure, but no, a lot of them did fine. So it was success in the face of the fact that most of their genre was getting, put out to pasture in one way or another, because guitar-oriented heavy music was changing when it came to the public's taste. But there had been a race to the top, right? Up to that point. So it's one of those things that everyone involved is somehow implicated in the oversaturation. it's like the news media. That shows no signs whatsoever of ever going away, no matter how bloated and awful and useless it is. It just keeps getting more diverse and more loud. I don't want to bring everybody down here, but that's the example I can think of that it's like mildew or fungus or something. It keeps growing and wrecking things but also creating more demand for itself. It's fascinating. I wish music was like that, but the problem with the music aspect of that model is you need money to sustain things. You need people with capital to invest in unknown artists that are challenging to the status quo. And that, on a very powerful but small level, is what was accomplished by Shrapnel Records and Mike Varney. So let's go back to his words. You have to sit and listen to me opine on things from time to time. So it's not just me reading an audiobook and then getting sued by the writer of said book, right? So he says in 1980, he decides to start Shrapnel. He went state to state to various music magazines and said to them, meaning he got in a car, I assume, and drove to various music magazines, unless it was just a letter writing campaign from, wherever he lived. I don't know. He's not very clear about it. I'm putting together a compilation of the 10 best unknown guitar players in America in the heavy metal style. And I'm looking for anybody in your neck of the woods that might be a candidate. Do you have anybody that could be one of the 10 best? There really was no territory that I approached that didn't think that they had somebody that could be a contender. I mean, that's like if you were an agent, like for actors, for young and up-and-coming actors that were incredibly desperate to prove themselves, and you went from state to state and said, I want the 10 best young people that, had the lead role in your production of Oklahoma last year. Do they have what it takes to be a star? Yes, of course. I know Janie or Vernon. Who in your town was the best performer in your high school presentation of Little Shop of Horrors? I'm gonna take the 10 best in, Suddenly Seymour's in the country. Everyone thinks they know someone that's supposed to be a star and has what it takes, when, of course, we know that it's not really a meritocracy for the most part. But in this magical case with Shrapnel Records, kind of sounds like it was. Why do you say that, Jay? Well, listen on, dear listeners, and I will tell you why. After talking to Mike Varney, all these articles, or all these magazines he went to, start running articles, to clue everyone into this big search for the 10 best unknown guitar players in America in the hard rock heavy metal style. And he says, Jas Obrecht at Guitar Player Magazine was reading about it in BAM magazine. I think Bay Area Metal or Bay Area Music, BAM, B-A-M. And Jas got a hold of me and said, hey, man, if you find these guys, I want to hear them. Isn't that convenient? Hey, man, while you're up, that's the while you're up person that really wants something from the fridge but isn't going to get up to go to the fridge. But while you're up, before you go to the bathroom, would you please get me something out of the fridge? Way to go, Jas Obrecht. Obviously, he's busy. He's doing a lot of intense stuff at Guitar Player Magazine. I'm just having a laugh here. Don't come at me. I'm the editor of Guitar Player Magazine. I wrote back to him, and we got in a conversation. And I said, I just made a record for EMI. I wrote a musical with Marty Balin called Rock Justice. And we had Jeff Pilson involved in it, singing and playing, and various other people, the rhythm section from Y&T, and a guy from the Tubes. It was a big kind of review show in San Francisco, and I co-wrote it. And there was a soundtrack out on EMI. EMI... I can't read that without hearing it in Johnny Rotten's voice because of that Sex Pistols song. Jas asked to hear it because, you couldn't just go on YouTube and find a pirated copy of it back then. You needed to send somebody a tape cassette in the mail. And then you would place said tape cassette into a tape cassette player. Somehow that led to an invitation to come down to the Guitar Player Magazine Halloween party. Yes! And the yes is mine, not Mike Varney's. And I brought a couple of young shredders with me. Man, Guitar Player Magazine Halloween party. Imagine how many not girls were there to hit on in sexy Halloween costumes. I imagine it looked something like the Halloween party in the Chips episode that featured Moloch and Elvira. What's that, you say? You don't know what I'm talking about? Well, my friends, double back to the episode of the history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll that's called Kiss number 2, Moloch Must Die. Mike Varney says, I brought a couple of young shredders with me. And it sounds, when you're reading that, you want it to sound, you want the word shredder to be something else. I brought a couple of young babes with me, perhaps. All right, I'm sorry. That would have been better, wouldn't it? Would have been a better story. Sorry, I'm still in Guns N' Roses mode. And these guys participated in their jam, and I saw publisher Jim Crockett hanging out, and this guy Tom Wheeler hanging out, who was, I think, senior editor at the time. I looked at guitar player, and I said, you've got this guy with his Ferrari, and this guy with his mansion, and this guy with his 5,000 guitars. But what about the guy who just goes to work at a regular blue-collar job and always wanted to be a guitar player and hasn't given up on his dreams? He's still playing and practicing and buying gear. What about those kind of guys? These kind of guys need to be in Guitar Player, and people reading Guitar Player magazine would have somebody to read about in their peer group. And it would be an obtainable thing for most people that were good. Maybe it would be something for them to look forward to and look for themselves in there and create a nice groundswell and grassroots kind of thing. I have this idea. I want to write this column. At the time, I had just maybe turned 23, and they said, well, write something. Well, let's see what you got. So I turned in a column, and they said, yeah, we'll do it. We created this column, and that's how it all started. Billy Sheehan's first piece of national press, as far as I know, was in that column. Scott Henderson, Paul Gilbert, Yngwie Malmsteen, Tony McAlpine, Vinnie Moore, Jason Becker, Greg Howe, Richie Kotzen, I think Michael Lee Firkins, maybe Joey Tafola. At least most of those ones. A lot of guitar players made their debuts. It was their first piece of press on a national or international level. Basically, I'm a huge collector. And I still buy tons of records. I know it's not fashionable now, but I'm actually into CDs instead of vinyl. I mean, that makes perfect sense, wouldn't it? I mean, CDs were the medium whereby lots of solo instrumental guitarists could very affordably record themselves and distribute their music. So I'm sure the CDs he's talking about are, late 80s through late 90s or something like that. Probably 2000s as well. Who am I kidding? Of course the 2000s as well. But at the time, I had tons and tons of vinyl and really loved to collect. Like I was alluding to earlier, there just wasn't a whole lot happening in 1980. And of course, this is the 1980 that on a major scale would give us Back in Black and, or am I thinking 88? Okay, I'm going to qualify. 80 to 81, we got Back in Black. We got Blizzard of Oz. We got some of the biggest, most commercially accepted hard rock all together in a long time. But that's not what he's talking about. He's like, what about the guys that aren't in the Scorpions? Because he had just gotten out of college and he had a degree in business administration with an emphasis on marketing. And he's thinking to himself, I don't think I'm alone here. I think there's some guys out there that really want to hear some ripping guitar playing. And there are guys out there that are ripping, and the focus is on disco, punk rock, and new wave. We really didn't have a focus on heavy metal in that early part of 1980. Bear that in mind. This is a little chunk of the timeline here before the big explosion in commercial heavy metal. And this guy's like, I can't wait for something that may or may not be on the horizon. I have to make this happen now to the best of my ability. He says, I just kind of caught a wave or helped create a wave. And Shrapnel started to become the first dedicated heavy metal label in America, but also to find the greatest guitar players. It was kind of a niche market. Yeah, you think? But that's what I studied in school. And that's what I was trying to create. And I'm curious about that. He doesn't really expand on that. What is it about creating or dominating a niche market that was from the lessons that he learned in business administration? That would be a great chunk of this to explore. I never wanted to be a huge record company. I mean, I know that seems crazy. No, it doesn't seem crazy at all. If you don't become huge, it doesn't get away from you. And it doesn't, you don't, you get to make Star Wars A New Hope, not be the guy that sells Star Wars to Disney and ruins everything. I mean, yeah, the billions of dollars is amazing, but I was never really that anxious to be huge. I just wanted to do stuff that I liked and work with artists that I thought were cool. Do stuff that I would want to listen to and buy myself for the most part. That's B-U-Y, myself, not by myself, B-Y, myself.
It's been too long.
Oh my God.
If I had advertisers, this is where I would do an ad read.
Yeah, totally.
Dude, and then you show this picture of Randy Coven with a
Rounding first base, BASS, Randy Coven.
yeah.
Who's the guy that looks like Sinister Gates in the middle there?
with a whammy bar, a bass with a whammy bar.
Al Petrelli.
That's Al Petrelli!
Yes, it is.
Petrelli.
It is Al
Megadeth
Petrelli.
He was the
and
guitar
Trans-Siberian's Orchestra's Al
Al
Petrelli.
Petrelli.
And more importantly, Sabotage.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Alice Cooper.
Savatish.
And look at the guitar he's got, Dan Tyson.
What is he playing?
It
Oh, is
looks-
that a fucking night swan? It
It
is a
looks
fucking
suspiciously
night
like a
swan.
night swan.
Wow.
What is a Night Swan? I'm a luthier and I don't know what a Night Swan
Night
is.
Swan was Vivian Campbell's guitar that it
Kramer.
was his signature Kramer that
Oh.
he brought out
Rip reverse headstock with the lightning.
with a weird pickup configuration.
two humbuckers and a single. It's from the bridge to the neck. It's this humbucker single coil.
Yeah,
which is
and
so
and the,
goofy.
and the single coil is where the set it's here. It's not here.
Right.
So there's a space, which is really weird. It's humbucker.
So when you say
humbucker.
here, describe it to the
well,
listeners.
you're the luthier, so I don't know. What are the words?
it's not the one up against the neck. It's
Right.
just like another space
It's
below it.
The first humbucker from the neck, or the second humbucker from the neck,
Okay.
Right.
which is where the single coil is on the Night Swan. It's
Right.
really weird.
Oh.
Yeah.
So
It's
it's,
an
It's tilted? And
It's not tilted.
It's not
straight,
tilted.
It's in the middle.
It's not tilted, but it's back from where it quote unquote should be.
yeah,
Sure,
it's
sure,
a
sure.
weird. It's a weird.
Yeah. Because it's a night
configuration.
swan and fuck you.
Yeah, because he had left Dio and joined Whitesnake and basically just started cashing all the guitar player checks, and then decided, "Fuck it, I don't want to work this hard. I'm gonna play rhythm guitar and Def Leppard
Def
for
Leppard.
30 years."
Yeah.
and just ART
An ART ad for with Max Norman.
power plant
That's so fantastic.
drive, rack drive.
What's the
Wow.
what kind of
I
board is he
remember
sitting
that
in
thing.
front of?
That
Seriously,
I can't tell from that
Yeah,
picture.
me either.
I honestly don't know.
that's
But the Max
hysterical.
Norman, Jakey Lee, sounds of Randy Rhoads, Jakey Lee, George Lynch, Akira Takasaki, who's spelled wrong,
Well,
Dude, that's the
Armored
best part.
Saint, Y&T, Grim Reaper.
what band
And
is...
orchestral maneuvers, not in the
In the
dark,
dark, just regular.
orchestral
They
maneuvers.
kicked out a third of the band,
yeah.
apparently.
Jesus
No, we're not doing
So-
anything. Orchestral maneuvers in the regular light.
Yeah.
apparently.
What's the band that the gentleman's name that's misspelled is in? Is he like Wolf?
Akira Takasaki was in Loudness.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say it's Loudness or it's Guitar Wolf, one of the
Oh,
two.
dude, that's so outstanding.
Yep.
I love so much about
Wow.
Jesus. So you're saying the Night Swan was essentially the guitar equivalent of Penn Jillette's house.
that. Mm-hmm.
It's so customized.
It's so
You can't
customized.
sell it to anybody but the person that customized it.
Yeah, yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's super ridiculous, which is why I want one.
Yeah. And it was such a thing. Like it was like
And if you own it,
Like-
then Extreme Elvis comes and pees all over himself in front of you.
Definitely. But the thing was, as I think you were just getting
Brian
to.
Tempe was actually there when that happened.
Yes, I was. It was a thing to behold. And then everyone naked in Penn's pool singing "Fuck Carrot Top."
I mean, these are
that
things
to
we
the-
don't forget.
To the tune of "Boy, You're Gonna Carry That Weight" by the fucking Beatles. I hope.
Kind of "Fuck Carrot Top, my lord," something like that. It was a thing to behold for sure.
Dude,
Things that happened in my life.
That's
I don't
amazing.
understand it.
that's
I
amazing.
mean, look at these. Look at the everything that's going on in this. Is that
So,
a Carvin ad, by the
ads are
way?
so good.
Oh, Soho.
Soho.
Jesus Christ.
No idea.
No one ever know. And
I mean,
clearly,
they clearly just copied a Mesa, right? That looks like a Mesa.
well, yeah, it's got a million knobs and a million knobs, and yeah, they just wanted to be Mesa Boogie, and they obviously did real well because I don't even remember it.
Now it's time for random quotes from various people to break things up a bit more. Solo artist Frank Gambale, or Frank Gambale. You could tell my age by my lack of awareness of how to pronounce his last name. He played with Chick Corea in the Electric Band, also played with Vital Information, and on his own stuff, obviously. He said, all those great fusion bands of the 70s, Return to Forever, Frank Zappa to some degree, Jean-Luc Ponty, Weather Report, really inspired us. And people like myself were just following in the great tradition of what we knew and loved in terms of that kind of music. Ty Tabor from King's X says, I'll be honest with you, the 80s were a depressing time for me musically and for guitar. Controversial statement to say the least. Tell us more, Ty, you amazing, amazing musician. I recognize that there were legendary players to come out of the 80s, and I loved listening to and still listen to. I still put on Joe Satriani records from then. I still listen to the great guitarists of the 80s. But when you take those 3 or 4 guitarists, 3 or 4, again, controversy. Or as you say in England, controversy. Music in general was somewhat a sad state of affairs for guitar. As far as I was concerned, in the 80s, coming out of the 70s was all about guitar. Every huge band up until disco, and even during disco, there were huge rock bands out there playing big gigs. But the early to mid 70s was just a guitar extravaganza. It was 2 guitars, bass and drums, in pretty much every rock band, unless it was Led Zeppelin with 1 guitar. But it was just in your face, unbelievable, godlike guitar playing throughout the 70s. Whether it be Humble Pie, Peter Frampton himself, all the British rock bands from that time that we were all listening to. For me, that was a really healthy, amazing time in music for rock guitar. And there were still a lot of independent FM stations all over the countries. I don't know if that's a misprint, countries. It changed during the 70s, but at the start of the 70s, they were still there. And regions played different music from other regions. There was not a national playlist yet. That is very important to note. There was no company that was going to buy out all of America's music at that time. Funny, he's talking about something that I personally and my friends moan about that happened in the early 2000s or late 1990s. It was, in his mind, already underway in the early 80s. That happened in the 80s. And that was an incredibly, horribly depressing time where I felt rock music was crushed by industry, crushed by the machine, by conformity, by making it, you must sound this way, look this way to get a deal anymore. And it was now all calculated. That's how I feel about the 80s, to be honest with you. Van Halen wasn't that. They were the real deal that everybody copied. How about a bit from a Michael Schenker? Scorpions, UFO, Michael Schenker Group, Temple of Rock. I feel what original people created in the 70s, it was something used later in the 80s, but it was simplified. If you listen to drums, the drums went 1 bass drum, 1 snare drum, keeping it very simple. The snare became very loud and took up a lot of space. He is not wrong. Go back and listen to the difference in the production styles and the mixing styles. Holy smokes. Chris Lord Alge, anybody? Big, loud snare dominating the entire song. I'm looking at you, Born in the USA. I know that's nothing to do with shred, but that's where things went. Big rock. I mean, Van Halen, around 1984, the album and the year, I think we can agree. There's a lot less subtlety when it comes to placement of the snare. And it had to have more room around it, so you had to take other things out. So you had to take out those ghost notes. You had to take out the overplaying. Now, Michael Schenker goes on to say that lead guitar playing was not simplified necessarily, but it lost a lot of feel. It became technical, drums became very primitive, and guitar playing became very technical. It was more commercial. I would just like to say I feel like I deserve a not an ugly American award for choosing not to read this in some horrible fake German accent like most Americans would. But then again, most Americans don't know who Michael Schenker is. And they probably don't know if they even as well that he was the brother of Rudolf Schenker, who was in a band called the Scorpions. Where does that come into play, Jay Smith, you ask? Oh, I don't know. Maybe in the very next paragraph of these quotes from Michael Schenker, where he says, the Scorpions basically copied everything UFO did. So whenever UFO would release an album 1 year later, the Scorpions would release an album with similar stuff on it. They used to come to my home and listen to my latest compositions. And I didn't think much of it. But I guess in the 70s, my contribution was important for the 80s. Bands like the Scorpions simplified it and made it more acceptable for the wide mass. The people who really cannot get that deep, but with a good packaging for the eye and playing it in a simple way that makes the people who watch them think, oh, maybe I can do this too. It made it more accessible. Can you imagine these motherfuckers if they had been born 30, 40 years later and they had come into power? Let's say the alternate universe where they come into power during the age of social media. Like the Michael and Rudy Schenker Twitter battles would be amazing. And we all wouldn't really know if it was a work or if it was a shoot, like if it was just carny bullshit or if it was brothers really hating each other. I mean, like let's say instead of pushing all them forward in the timeline, let's push social media back in the timeline, right? So let's do it with the unfamiliarity with the dangers of cocaine and a sudden familiarity with how social media works. And there's still stadium gigs and huge Marshall stacks. And oh my God, can you imagine? Can you imagine? Like, it could be like the East Coast, West Coast. Sorry, it's getting late. East Coast, West Coast hip hop wars, being played out with lead guitarists and bands, starting beefs and people getting shot after shows because of their just egos going bonkers. Oh, I'm so glad it didn't happen, but I want to go to the universe where it did happen. I want to see what MTV News was like in that universe for just like 6 months. Jump back into a few more random quotes from Greg Prato's amazing book, Shredders, The Oral History of Speed Guitar. Mike Varney points out that Vai has replaced Yngwie Malmsteen in Alcatraz, but it was a little too late at that point in time. He had been known as this amazing transcriber and technician for Frank Zappa and for putting out the Flexible series. But the Alcatraz Disturbing the Peace record really showed Steve in a rock context. Now, Steve Stevens says, being in Billy Idol's band, the whole punk rock thing, he came from that English school of punk rock, 1977. And they were really against virtuoso guitar playing. So I would always have to defend the virtuoso guys. And Billy loved Public Image, as well as I did. Metal Box, all that stuff. Then, when the record Album came out, it was a Public Image Limited album entitled Album. It was almost like validation that you could do virtuoso guitar playing in the context of something really, really different. And both Idol and I really liked that record. He went, that Vai guy, he's good, right? And I went, yeah, he's about as good as they get. I love the fact that when you have rock or metal guys who are not just doing rock or metal music, when they're taken out of that, then they really shine. It was really refreshing, and it was something that I think a lot of the punk people that followed John Lydon into Public Image couldn't deny. You couldn't deny the fact that being technically gifted as a guitar player was still cool. It wasn't noodling for the sake of noodling. Guthrie Govan, Aristocrats guitarist, also worked with Steven Wilson and Asia, says, with Public Image, I think it was just the context. You have this figurehead of naughtiness and John Lydon. The last thing you would expect him to do is assemble a band with people who have been to Berkeley. So I like the contradiction in the lineup. The vocal delivery on that album is just so sneering and ironic, infused with a certain kind of justifiable hate for something or other. I just thought Steve's quirkiness offset the general mood of that record really well, because it was the last thing that anyone would expect. Now let's take a quote from Mr. Billy Sheehan. In the summer of '85, I got a phone call from Dave's office. Most of you probably know what Dave he's referring to. But he was going to do a movie and wanted to know if I wanted to be in it. I thought, gee, I guess. I was already going out to Los Angeles to play a show because Talus, the band he was in at the time, was playing there on the Yngwie tour. So I said, as long as I'm coming out there, I'll have a meeting with you. Immediately he said, well, there is a movie, but that really wasn't why I called you. I want to start a band. I want you to go find a guitar player and a drummer and have a band. I'm going to quit Van Halen. And I said, okay, I'm in. I went to the show we did the next night at the Palladium, I believe it was, in Los Angeles, and Dave was at the show. A couple of people started a few rumors, but we kept it quiet. He told me not to say anything to anyone, just keep it a safe secret. And I did. So when I finished that tour, they flew me out to LA and we began the Eat 'em and Smile adventure. Originally, Steve Stevens was Dave's idea for guitar. Stevie's great, a wonderful guy, great player. But I think he decided to stick with Billy Idol because they were very successful at the time. Worth noting that Steve Stevens probably has songwriting and publishing money with Billy Idol throughout the years that he worked with him, which would be hard to walk away from, quite frankly, at that point. And whatever did happen, and however David Lee Roth structured the payment system within his band and the songwriting contributions, I'm not aware. But if you are an up-and-coming hotshot guitarist and you got a good gig like that, and you think, this guy's doing a solo thing away from Van Halen, and he wants to have, that kind of control, it could be a bit hard to predict what he was going to do financially with, the band setup. I have nothing to base that on. I'm just putting myself in someone's shoes at the time and projecting, basically. So Billy Sheehan tells David Lee Roth, I know another Steve. And Steve at the time was on the label that I was on, Relativity Records. He had just put out Flexible. And I was actually going to get in touch with Steve to do some things that he and I together. So I knew him, had spoken with him one night, and said, there might be something coming up that you might be interested in, and I can't tell you about it. And he goes, I think I know what it is. We'll talk about it later. So that's how Steve got in. I brought Steve in. I didn't get him the gig as much as his talent got him the gig, but I was glad to bring him in, and he's the perfect guy for the job. Steve himself says, that was Billy Sheehan. Billy recommended me. I was a huge fan. There was something very alluring about Dave's rock star aura, so it was a little bit surreal because I was just such a big fan of the band also, and making Eat 'em and Smile was a very private affair. All of this stuff was going on in the outside world, and I had no idea it had such momentum. The fact that Dave had left Van Halen. Who is this new guitar player? Oh, it's the guy that did the Attitude song and Crossroads, and he was with Frank Zappa. It was a mystique building, but I was completely unaware of it because we were just going into the basement and practicing and practicing and writing and practicing. I didn't really know about how international press worked. So there was all this momentum that I was completely unaware of. Making the record was kind of surreal, working with Ted Templeman, and just Dave himself was incredibly educational and inspiring. Now let's wrap this section up with another little look back at Steve Stevens, at least from Steve's perspective. Steve Stevens says he met Steve Vai right before the recording of the David Lee Roth record. Steve Stevens was finishing up Whiplash Smile with Billy Idol and had already signed a solo deal with Warner Brothers. Okay, so that could be, that could make it sticky to jump over to David Lee Roth. I mean, Van Halen's on Warner Brothers, and he'd probably lose his solo deal. I was signed by Ted Templeman, and Ted produced Dave's EP. He made the decision to leave Van Halen, so my name got thrown in there, and Dave flew to New York. I was already committed to finishing up the Billy Idol record and do the tour, and I was just not available. And then I think Billy Sheehan was the first guy decided upon for that band. And Dave came and asked me about other guitar players, and I think somehow Steve Vai's name came up. I was aware of him from the Zappa stuff. And I said, absolutely, that guy is a monster. But when they started the record, they were at the power station. I got a call from Ted Templeman asking if they could borrow some of my gear. So I sent over a bunch of my plexis. I was more than happy to help and assist in that. Steve was just such an innovative guitar player. Really, other than his dexterity and being able to do the whole tapping thing, there were a lot of other guitar players after Eddie who jumped on that bandwagon. But Steve, I love the fact that he interpreted it his own way. And obviously working with Frank Zappa gave him the courage to march to his drummer compositionally. Nobody was anywhere near close to what Vai was doing as a solo artist as well. I respect any guitar player like that. Isn't that nice? Nice people doing nice things for each other, helping each other get gigs, helping each other make records. Yowza, yowza, yowza. This is very, very pleasing, very pleasant after the deep dive I took on things like, oh, Dave Ellefson from Megadeth was there at the party where Nikki Sixx overdosed on heroin with Slash from Guns N' Roses. Just a bunch of nice boys here in pants that are very tight and shiny, playing guitar notes really fast, doing their own thing. Good for them. Now back to Mike Varney and the creation of Shrapnel Records. His column gets noticed by a whole lot of individual hotshot guitarists playing in their bedrooms or making tapes at home. People like Marty Friedman, who is living in Hawaii. He's teaching students how to play guitar. Of course, he's got a subscription to Guitar Player magazine because he's probably going to use that for reference for some of his own lessons and such. I'm going to assume that you know who Marty Friedman is if you're listening to this. I'm assuming you're going to know the names of most of the artists I mention, and if you don't, that's a great opportunity for you to start looking them up. I think it'll be a waste of time for me to explain who everybody is all along this little journey here because the folks that know shred guitar know these names. Folks that don't know shred guitar won't benefit much from my giving a reference for why these guys are known in the industry, other than, if you don't know who Marty Friedman is, maybe you've heard of the band Megadeth and or Megadeth, if you take the Chris Poland pronunciation. But that still doesn't, tell you exactly what he did in his career. Anyway, he sends his stuff to Mr. Varney. Does not get put in the column, unfortunately, which makes him a little grouchy. But he does get a record contract from Varney. So, yeah, he digs that. Jason Becker sends a cassette demo with about 10 songs to try to get in the magazine. He gets a phone call from Mike Varney and tells him how great he is, tells him how sloppy his recordings are, and how badly he needs to re-record them. He also suggests Jason Becker go meet Marty Friedman. Well, Marty and Jason spend a few months hanging out, jamming together, and that leads to Jason Becker joining Marty in the Shrapnel Records, lineup because they decide they want to make a sort of dual guitar album together instead of it just being a solo Marty Friedman piece. This is when Jason Becker is 16 years old. Tony McAlpine sends a tape to Mike Varney at Guitar Player magazine. He gets in the Spotlight column and gets invited to come out to California and make a record. So he does. He flies up to San Francisco, stays there for about, 10 years or so, making albums. Paul Gilbert is a name that I never really can quite put into context very well in terms of the history of all the shreddy guitar stuff, because I became aware of him in the band Mr. Big when they were riding high on their acoustic power ballad. And I slowly came to understand that he had been around for a long time. He had done a lot of other, shreddy stuff, similar to Nuno Betancourt, who was riding high on MTV at the same time for his acoustic power ballad in the band that he was in. Both situations were completely unrepresentative of the body of work of those guitarists in question. So I was happy to get a little more of his story in this book. I have seen some of his videos. I've seen his instructional stuff. He always seems like a very jolly, personable guy that's got a great outlook on music and on life. So I've admired him for a long time, but never really heard much about his story. I knew he was in a band called Racer X, I once heard a live cover of Children of the Grave that they did. That's one of my favorite Black Sabbath songs. So he was always a very impressive player every time I heard what he was doing. I also loved his cameo appearance and guitar solo work on Guitar Hero Hero, the song by MC Lars, which I highly recommend you go look up the video for. It also features the singer from Nerf Herder. And it is catchy as hell. So, Paul Gilbert is in a small town in Pennsylvania, has no idea how to get in contact with anyone in the music business. And, he sees this feature in Guitar Player magazine, which was really, as he says, the only magazine at the time. And at the end of it, it says, anybody who sends me a cassette, I promise I'll send a reply. And that was exciting to me. He talks about this being after Randy Rhoads had passed away, and, young teenage Paul Gilbert has a fantasy in mind that, like, what if I'm good enough to get noticed by this guy? And then someone talks about me to the people at Ozzy Osbourne's, office. What if I, he's dreaming of, like lots of kids dream of winning the World Series or the Super Bowl or whatever, being a karate master or something. And if you're an electric guitarist that plays solos in 1981, that's the equivalent of, hitting the game-winning home run at the World Series as being the guitarist for Ozzy Osbourne at that time. That's like being a fighter pilot. And he's inspired by this column written by Mike Varney. So he says he makes a cassette of some solos and a couple of tunes, sent them to Mike. It took 3 days for the cassette to get out there. I think it might have even been before there was FedEx. So you had to wait 3 days, and Mike called me up right when he got the cassette, and he really encouraged me. He was really complimentary about my playing. And I don't know if he knew Ozzy or anything, but he seemed like he had some connections. When he found out I was 14 years old, then he sort of told me the reality of that. But he was still very encouraging and wanted me to record for some of the compilations he was doing at the time. Part of the deal was he would advance the money for the recording studio, and I'd bring my band in to record it. Just that, again, nobody could do home recordings then. There wasn't even the gear. And even if there was, I couldn't afford it. But the idea of going into the studio was just a dream. So I began to send Mike demos of songs, and I was trying really hard. This was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me. So I was really trying my best. And he would call me up, usually 3 days later, and he would say, "This is horrible. Are you joking? This is extremely bad." He would just cut me apart. And he'd say, "The guitar playing is fine, but your songwriting is so bad, I can't believe it." Can you imagine being a grown adult with a job in the music industry, in the music press, and like being that insulting to a 14-year-old kid, just using your position to do that? I cannot. I don't think that makes someone a better musician. I think that's just the ego of the person criticizing. Unless you're giving them specifics, unless you're telling them what's lacking in a specific part of your song, not that just that this is bad. So he sends him another song and gets a phone call from Mike who says, "This is even worse." Fortunately, I had the optimism and the energy to keep going and just go, okay, let me keep trying. So that's what I did. And it got to the point where he said, "You just sent me a bunch of songs. I like them all. Instead of doing a compilation appearance, let's form a band around you when you get to LA and we'll do a whole album." So he wasn't just beating me up. He was telling me the truth. And it was nice to hear that and to be able to be inspired by it. It's kind of a rough way to be inspired. But again, I was 15, 16 years old at that point and had tough enough skin to deal with it and just work hard enough to get my writing together. For his part, Mike Varney also talks about how Richie Kotzen sent him a zillion tapes. He got 2 demos a week from him at one point. He notes that most of the artists he signed never drank or did drugs. They were kids from good homes that were really focusing. Everything was riding on their guitar playing. That's what I really looked for, all those techniques, stylistic things, and originality. But a lot of it was, can this guy be a guy with people that people would look up to and say, this guy is a serious force to be reckoned with, and will this guy have a career? Will this guy be around 20 years from now, or will he just fade out? Most of the guys I've worked with, at least the guys I've had success with, are still active, doing their thing. You can go to a lot of other labels and look at artists they've signed, and no one's ever heard anything about them ever again.
So what's the
Anyway,
what's
sorry.
the defining moment post Van Halen? I guess is one of the first questions I want to
For
ask.
shred. Okay, so
For shred.
So like shred's kind of you get some shred with like Return to Forever, right?
By
you
whom?
get John McLaughlin.
Oh yeah,
you
yeah.
get
But
Al
that
Di
was that was before Eddie Van Halen.
Yeah, way before.
Way before Eddie Van
you,
Halen.
So you have these guys, these
Yeah.
virtuosic like guitar players.
Mahavishnu Orchestra.
Yeah.
And then
McLaughlin and Demiola were
Yeah.
pretty much in the rock. Well, in the things that were leaning rock, so like jazz fusion.
Yeah.
Those were the guys. I mean,
Okay.
like they were the big ones, anyways.
And then combine that with Jeff Beck with the sort of melodic
Right.
sensibility of like, oh, I'm gonna have a hit with the instrumental song.
Right.
So that's my thing about Beck was that I never got too hard into it, but I at least recognize that like he's got a crazy sense of melody.
Mm-hmm.
He got hooks for days in his actual phrasing,
Mm-hmm.
but then he throws down some jazzy things that are not as jazzy as stuff that I wouldn't want to listen to, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
And he blended those two
and
things.
that's where that thing happens, where you take like John McLaughlin and you take Al Di Meola and like Friday Night in San Francisco, which is not a record that should exist because
So I've
fuck
been,
that record.
I've been
Right.
your friend for a long time, and I know what you mean when you say that. But to the people that aren't used to how you talk, what do you mean by that should not exist?
I just mean that it's basically fuck you to every guitar player that listens to it afterwards. Like
Yeah.
it's just eat 7 dicks. You're not ever going to be this good,
Right.
And all three of us are this good, and we're having fun, and we're improvising. We're making this up as we go.
and
along.
are they like an electric combo, or is he playing acoustic?
No, it's three. So it's Paco de Lucia playing Spanish guitar with his fingers.
Yeah, because he's a dick.
Because he's an asshole.
Yeah,
Uh,
100%.
John McLaughlin just
Being John
destroying
McLaughlin.
worlds all over everybody.
Oh, okay.
And Al Di Meola.
Okay.
And it's
I'm getting a picture here.
It's I think it's Paco de Lucia in the left channel. John McLaughlin is in the center, and Di Meola's
Miela's
on the right.
Yeah, if I remember right.
And it's
so ridiculous.
like you
I
can't
hate-
listen to the whole thing.
I hate-
Like you
I-
just get mad immediately.
Oh yeah, I hate that
You
album
hate
so
that
much.
record.
Like you just might as well like just do burpees for an hour.
It's
Yes, it's worse than
it's
that,
worse
though.
than that.
It's
It's worse
worse.
because the effect. Like I haven't heard that record in probably 25 years. Like
Oh yeah, I hate it.
purposefully
I
listened
hate
to it.
I hate talking about
No,
it.
exactly. I'm angry now. I'm out of here. I'm leaving.
So I'm gonna
Fuck
jump.
both of you.
I'm gonna jump out the window and hopefully kill myself.
But
and before I forget, Steve Morse too.
Yeah,
was
oh,
one
yeah,
of the
Steve
early
Morse, of
guys in the
course.
Dregs.
Dixie
yeah,
Dregs.
Dixie Dregs. Yeah.
Which,
Dixie
which,
Dregs.
which reminds me of a
Remember
funny
that-
story.
Remember that one time?
One time when Andy West
Andy-
helped us load up Brian's gear.
Load
but
gear.
that's another
The
story.
bass player of the
For-
Dixie Dregs,
Yeah.
like 2 months ago, helped us load gear. That was kind of amazing.
To quote Dana Gould, that's an amazing story that I have to tell, but this is not the time or the place. Anyways,
Anyway, that one time.
And leaving you hanging there, let's go into some more Steve Vai origin story. Now, I'm going to pull from Guitar World magazine, April 1990. Satriani and Vai are both on the cover. Slip of the Tongue by Whitesnake is transcribed inside, so is Skid Row's I Remember You. And I'm also going to jump from this to a book called Play It Loud by Brad Tolinsky and Alan DePerna. It's a history of the electric guitar. Alan DePerna is the guy conducting the Guitar World interview that I'm going to start with, though. And I'm only going to refer to it for a couple of pieces. It's pretty long, in-depth interview, and it has a really nice sort of setup at the beginning. He's talking to Vai first, and then Satriani shows up partway into the interview. This is the sort of time that these guys are riding high on what, up to this point, is their most, important release in their careers, that being Whitesnake's Slip of the Tongue and Joe Satriani's Flying in a Blue Dream. Do you disagree with that? Do you disagree that at this point in their careers, those would be their most high-profile releases? Call in now. Call in now and let's talk about it. Phones are not lighting up. All right, I'll get back to it. Vai says, there was this family in town called the Cavallagnes. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry. Clavagnes. I suppose it's like Bolognese. Calavanese. And this is why this podcast is free, ladies and gentlemen. And he's talking about the town of Carle Place, Carle, in the New York area. And Steve Vai says of the family, they had 7 or 8 kids. One of the older ones was in a band with Joe Satriani. They used to do all the Led Zeppelin songs and stuff. The name of the band was Tarsus. And when I formed a band with the younger brother, Barry, we were like a carbon copy of those guys, only 4 years later. We even named ourselves Susrat, which is Tarsus spelled backwards. Later, we changed it to Rage. Joe taught us all the songs that Tarsus used to do. We used to play all the clubs, and it was really cool. The Calavanese house has so many memories for me, too. That was the place where, you know, when you're growing up and you first experiment with drugs and sex and everything, that's where it all happened, in the Calavanese basement, which was just a crawl space under this big house in the middle of town. The school and local pizza joint were right in back, and there was the Sea of Emotions, which Joe will tell you about. As if on cue, says Alan DePerna in his narrative, Joe Satriani steps through the door, guitar case in hand. Standing side by side, Satch and Vai are a study in contrasts. Dressed in black from head to toe, Satriani is a compact, quiet man who radiates a sense of inner intensity, like the eye of a hurricane. Vai is more outgoing, wheeling energetically around the cluttered control room, standing a head taller than his former teacher. His long limbs draped in the most wildly multicolored running suit you would ever care to observe. He does much of the talking, but always leaves Satch space to get his licks in. Back to Vai. I was telling about the mirror image band situation with Tarsus and Susrat, how we'd emulate your band. In fact, someone told me that before each gig, you guys used to have Coca-Cola and eggs in the morning, so we started doing that. Satriani says, great, which is probably why he's sick right now. It was the old clogged artery diet. So you two never actually worked together in a band? Satriani, oh no. At that age, when you're in high school, 9th grade and 11th grade are a long way apart. But you did have lessons together. Vai says, yeah, it started out where Joe was teaching a friend of mine who lived a couple of houses away. My friend was actually able to hit notes on the guitar, and I thought that was phenomenal. And he said, well, you should see my teacher. He can really play. I couldn't really afford lessons, so I chipped in with another friend, and Joe taught us both at the same time. How long did that go on for? Maybe a year, Satriani. I'd say that would be pushing it. I can't recall exactly when it happened, but I do seem to remember suggesting that the lessons be separated. That more could be accomplished if we did. Vai says, yeah, you could get an extra $5. I remember my first lesson with Joe. I had a guitar and a pack of strings. I'd never really played the instrument. I didn't know how to tune or string it or anything. Satriani points out that he did play accordion at that time, though, and Vai confirms. Satriani says, I immediately said, have some Coke, have some eggs. Vai says, sit down for a while in the sea of emotion, drop some acid. Satriani says, do that for a few months, and then we'll get to notes and the strings. Alan DePerna says, all right, what is the sea of emotion exactly? Satriani, the sea of emotion? It's a place, to Steve. You know, I went back there when I was in New York a few months ago. It looked so different. Vai says, I remember the sewer ramps used to seem so large. And I went back and they were around this big. I assume he's like holding his hands up in a small way. Are we talking about some kind of garbage dump here? Satriani says, no, it was a field, part of an old farm where they'd build 3 schools. The field sort of dipped down, almost as if it was a dry lake bed. It was a place where you'd go to think, to pour out what was in your mind and in your heart. I must have brought you there one day, he says to Steve. Vai says, yeah, in your Volkswagen. We were driving around and we just sat there a while. At the time, I was so in awe of Joe because he was the teacher. I used to just sit and listen. He'd pour out his heart and laughs. No, it was just that back then, like you were saying, because we were several years apart, there was always this great admiration factor from us younger guys for the older guys. When I was playing the Nassau Coliseum recently, I got on my bicycle and rode all the way from the Coliseum to the school. I always take a bicycle on tour with me. And I actually went to my first kindergarten classroom, which was still there. And I saw some of the teachers I had known in high school. He says to Joe, I saw Mr. Nickel, and we talked about you for a while. Really? Mr. Nickel? He was at Woodstock. He was in the movie. Vai says, yeah, that was his big thing. You got to be prepared. I was at Woodstock, and nobody had any food or clothing or anything. Now jumping over to Play It Loud from the chapter entitled Made in Japan. He is talking about Vai. He spent his teens taking lessons from another future guitar hero, Joe Satriani, who immediately saw Vai's potential. Satriani taught him the intricacies of music theory and proper playing technique. I got a kick out of sitting across from a 13-year-old Steve Vai and realizing this kid is going to be playing better than me, Satriani recalls. I just instinctively knew it. I mean, you don't have to instinctively know it if you're observing him. That's not instinct. That's evidence, sir. Whatever. Many youngsters would have bridled at the discipline. Vai took to it with the dedication that would become his calling card. Joe Satriani set an amazingly high standard and pulled me up to it, said Vai. My lessons were the most important thing in my life. They were treasures. He was determined to keep pushing the limits of his playing. In 1979, during his stay at Berkeley, which is a music school in Boston area, Vai reached out to the legendary Frank Zappa, perhaps one of the only musicians in the rock world whose standards and workaholism exceeded his own. Zappa, a guitarist and composer of complex, satirical music, had a reputation as a fearsome band leader who demanded nothing less than perfection from musicians. In an act of sheer chutzpah, Vai mailed Frank a painstakingly accurate transcription he had made of Zappa's The Black Page, an outrageously complicated drum instrumental along with a tape of his own guitar playing. Much to Vai's surprise, Zappa responded. He hired Vai to transcribe a number of the guitar solos that were published in the Frank Zappa Guitar Book in 1982. Zappa also then enlisted the guitarist to become a full-fledged band member, often referring to Vai admiringly as his little Italian virtuoso. While the gig didn't exactly make Steve famous, Zappa's music was too bizarre, his following too underground for that, Vai was immediately put on the short list of musicians to watch in the guitar community. To be so young and receive praise by someone as discerning and brilliant as Frank Zappa was no small thing, and people began to take notice. It certainly didn't hurt Steve's cause that he was a tall, dark, and had the bone-chiseled structure. Wait. He was tall, dark, and had the chiseled bone structure of a natural-born rock star. Sorry, everybody. So as Vai is transitioning away from being a member of Frank Zappa's band and into joining the band Alcatraz, he wants to make a change in his gear. He's been playing a Fender Stratocaster for a long time. He doesn't really love the sound of it, but it has a whammy bar, which is something that he needs to be able to do the kind of tricks that he does on the old fretboard. And he says, I love the big humbucking sound of a Les Paul. At the same time, I instinctively understood the potential of a whammy bar. For that reason, I had to have a Strat, but I didn't like the way the Stratocaster sounded. They never seemed rock and roll to me. They're always a little hard to play, and the single coil pickups were a little thin sounding, but that was my main axe. I got a Maple Strat when I was 15 or 16, and it didn't sound great, but it had a whammy bar, and I beat that whammy bar to death. I was using this Strat all the way up through my days with Frank. Then when Van Halen hit the scene, and he had a guitar with a whammy bar and a humbucker, that changed a lot of things. Zappa humorously would refer to Steve Vai's tone as sounding like a ham sandwich or a bunch of buzzing flies. So he gets the shot with Alcatraz, a melodic hard rock band based out of Hollywood, and takes this opportunity to rethink his approach to his own tone. And part of that is Alcatraz basically kind of demanding a bigger, louder, chunkier sound. They introduce Steve to a guy named Grover Jackson, the custom builder who was making guitars for Randy Rhoads, Jeff Beck, people like that. And seeing Vai's potential to become the next big thing, Jackson lent him a brown guitar he had designed for Charavel. Now, Vai says it was fantastic. It had a humbucker and a whammy bar, and Grover made one of the closest instruments to what I was looking for, but there were still things about it I wasn't crazy about. Vai goes to Frank and talks to Zappa about this guitar. Zappa asks him, what aren't you crazy about? And Vai gives him like a laundry list of things that he wishes he could change. Didn't have enough frets. Cutaway wasn't deep enough. He didn't like the shape of the body. He thought it should be sexier, things like that. And Vai says, one of the things I learned working with Frank, who was the most extraordinary man I ever met, when he would get an idea for something, he would just do it. He would work until he found a solution, whether it was a problem with notation, instrumentation, lyrics, recording techniques, guitars, or guitar effects. So I started experimenting with custom guitar builders, and one of the first ones that I had made was by Valdez Guitar, but it was still more of a Strat. It didn't fit my needs. When I was asked to play in the David Lee Roth Band in 1985, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to stop until I found the guitar of my dreams. He goes on to say, I was still using the borrowed Charvel, which I had taken the liberty of painting fluorescent green, much to Wayne's chagrin. It was the main guitar that I used on my first album with Roth, Eat 'Em and Smile. But when it came time to tour, I needed some backups, and I wanted to have something made. I went to this little guitar shop in Hollywood called Performance Guitar, and I took the Frank approach. I was going to be relentless until I got what I wanted. So he basically takes what Van Halen had already done with his guitar and expands on it and refines it and, demands more features that will help him achieve what he wants to achieve with his playing. Now, before I continue, we got to talk about the invention of the Floyd Rose locking system, bridge and nut system. A lot of you listening that already like shred guitar know the basics of how guitars work. For those that don't understand why the Floyd Rose was such an innovation and a huge technological leap forward for guitarists of the 80s, I'm going to break it down like this. Bear with me if you already know this stuff. It shouldn't take too long. The Fender Stratocaster was the first guitar built with the kind of tremolo, or it's technically a vibrato. It changes the pitch of the note when you wiggle the whammy bar by moving the bridge up and down. That was as reliable and as dramatic as it was. There had been ones before that by Bigsby. Merle Travis had a guitar with like a tremolo. Might have been a Bigsby tremolo on it. But those were very subtle sounding. You couldn't do these really interesting, dramatic, shimmery sounds like people wanted to replicate from hearing pedal steel country players or from hearing Hawaiian, music. So that's what Leo Fender went on to innovate. Let me look at the patent application on my wall that's framed that my mom gave me of the Fender Stratocaster and double check the date that's on that. Yes, it says tremolo device for stringed instruments filed in 1954, and then granted in 1956. Now, tremolo is a misnomer. It's just one of those things, unfortunately, it was named by the inventor who I could go back and look in a couple of different books about the history of Fender guitars as to why he called it that. Tremolo is a volume-based effect. Vibrato is a pitch-based effect. And what a vibrato arm or whammy bar does is it will loosen or tighten the strings on your guitar by raising or lowering the bridge. And that makes the pitch of the note move around. Tighter is a higher note. Boing. Looser is a lower note. And then you pull it back up to do that like car engine, noise at the beginning of Kickstart My Heart. That's dive, pull up, dive, pull up, dive, pull up. But on a Stratocaster, what you have is you have a ball end of the string, and then you have a pointy end of the other side of the string. The ball end is like a bead that the whole string is tied up around, just like in a violin string or a cello string or viola, all kinds of those, stringed instruments in the orchestra. Well, that ball end sits in the back of the block of a bridge. Say baby. That block is like the tail end of your guitar where it anchors that bead or that, that little ball end of the string. And after that, the string goes up and against the top of that plate and then over the top of the saddle. And those 6 saddles have to be placed in a very specific way for your heavy and skinny strings to play in tune properly. We don't need to get into that right now. But after the saddle, it's then stretched across the length of the neck of the guitar and the body of the guitar into a nut slot. There's 6 of those to keep those strings separated in the right distance from each other so you can play things easily. Then it goes under a little bracket. Then it goes onto the head of a tuning peg that is tightened up until your string is at the right pitch. Okay? All those things are there to allow Leo Fender to crank out a ton of guitars with a flat head stock, not a tilted back one like you see on jazz guitars or Gibson Les Pauls and Gibson SGs and stuff like that at the time. because this allows him to cut pieces of wood out without wasting so much wood with that tilted back headstock, which is sort of necessary for the kind of downward pressure you want at the end of the string to make the instrument resonate the way a violin would or a cello would. That's why they have tilted back headstocks, and also helps keep the strings lined up and, down in their nut slots. So he's got a little bracket that he's invented to put over those to hold them in the nut slots and then create some downward pressure as well. Well, when you are Jimi Hendrix and then you dive bomb on songs like Machine Gun or the Star Spangled Banner, you're not going to be in tune when you come back up, when you go with your strings, because you're playing through huge Marshall amps and you have a fuzz pedal in front of it, and you have tons of sustain and feedback noise that you're making because you're awesome and you're Jimi Hendrix and you figured this stuff out in the way that no one else has. What happens is you are dramatically slackening and loosening and then suddenly springing back and tightening 6 different strings of 6 different gauges under different levels of pressure individually, but you're doing it to them all at the same time. And every contact point they have on the guitar, every surface they're stretched across, from the back of the tail block up to the top of the tail block, over the top of the saddle, into the nut, under those little brackets, and then into a tuner, peg that they're wrapped around 3 or 4 times. And those windings are loosening and tightening, loosening and tightening, loosening and tightening. Underneath the bracket, it's loosening and tightening. Underneath, on top of the nut, it's loosening and tightening. Side to side, if that nut slot's too tight, it could be getting caught up there. Then you have over the top of the saddle, it's loosening and tightening. All those different places are places where strings are going to get hung up and they're going to not go back to the tune, the pitch that you had them in when you originally tuned up the guitar. All right? So the Floyd Rose system, I'll get into the origin in a second, but what conceptually it does is it takes all of that out of the equation, and the only parts of the string that are in play are the one length of the string between a clamp at the nut and a clamp at the bridge. Now, they're just, if you dive bomb, you're just flopping around on top of the fretboard itself. You're not dragging that string over 5 other points of contact where it can get hung up. Now, here's where the book Play It Loud kind of edges out the book Shredders by Greg Prato in a way. Possibly the Shredders book didn't go into this kind of detail because Play It Loud had already done it. But, Shredders has a lot more of an oral history of people reacting to things they're being interviewed about. Oh, when this album came out, it was amazing. Oh, when this guitar came out, it changed the game entirely, right? And you just read 5 different personalities that are famous from that era talking about it in the book Shredders. But Play It Loud, I've been flipping back and forth between these 2 books, and I had to remind myself by looking in the index where this one specific detail about Eddie Van Halen and Floyd Rose was. So to go back in time a little bit from where we left the Steve Vai conversation, let's go into the chapter Eruptions from Play It Loud by Brad Tolinsky and Alan DePerna. In addition to revamping the cosmetics of his main Frankenstein guitar, Van Halen would help refine another major guitar innovation, the locking tremolo system. Using a whammy bar was a major part of his playing technique, allowing him to bend notes dramatically. But excessive use often caused his strings to fall hopelessly out of tune. He had developed a number of strategies to minimize the problem, but he was unable to come up with a solution that worked all the time. Just as Ed Starr was rising, a guitarist named Floyd Rose was dealing with the same set of issues. Rose was playing in a rock band and wanted to use his whammy bar the way his hero Jimi Hendrix did, but was frustrated when the guitar wouldn't stay in tune. Using skills acquired from years of jewelry making, he devised an ingenious system of clamps that would lock the strings of the guitar at the nut where the neck meets the head, and again at the bridge. Together, they'd keep the guitar in tune, even under extreme duress. And then here's where it becomes like the moment where Pete Townsend introduces Jim Marshall to Jimi Hendrix, right? Like Townsend said, it's like introducing some mad dictator to a guy that invents the atomic bomb. Rose shared his invention with his friend Lynn Ellsworth, who immediately thought of Edward. So I went with him to show Eddie the locking system I created, says Floyd Rose. He liked it and gave me a guitar to put one on. Now, Eddie takes the story from here and says, my role in the design and development of the Floyd was adding the fine tuners to the bridge. Now, the fine tuners, pausing for a second here, are these little wheels. There's 6 little wheels on the Floyd Rose bridge, just like there are 4 little wheels on a violin bridge or a cello bridge or a viola bridge. It's not a new idea, but it is for guitar. They are there to basically, if you tighten them down, put more pressure on the string, which raises the note, the pitch of the note. If you loosen them, you release tension and pressure on the string, thereby slackening in little micro doses to try to get, basically, when you're clamping up a Floyd Rose, you want to be in as close to pitch as you can. But then, over the course of days and weeks and months, those fine tuners give you anywhere from like a quarter of a step to maybe a half step, depending on the gauge of strings you're using and how things are set up, to make sure you don't have to just unclamp the whole thing and retune it when things, get a bit weird. As Eddie says, strings stretch, temperature changes, and depending on how hard you play, your guitar would go out of tune. So you have to unclamp the nut, which involves loosening 3 screws with an Allen wrench, tune the guitar, reclamp the nut down again. There wasn't enough time to do all this in between every song live. To put it simply, it was a pain in the ass. So Eddie's the guy that makes that innovation happen for Floyd Rose, which eventually makes this invention something that everybody, has to have on their guitars for the next 10 years if they are a hotshot lead guitar player. Now, the book Shredders by Greg Prato has a Floyd Rose chapter with interview segments from George Lynch, Joe Satriani, Steve Stevens, Steve Lynch, Tony McAlpine, many, many more. It's their impressions of, what kind of hardware they liked and how the Floyd Rose kind of treated them over the years and whether they liked it or not or how great it was. I still highly recommend that book, but maybe not so much for a history of the gear. So here's the next step. The Floyd Rose is set up to exist on the body of the guitar the way a Fender traditional tremolo was. It is sitting flat against the body. So it clonks down if you pull back on the bar. You can adjust the springs in the back that hold it in place to loosen them so that the back end of your bridge rises up with string tension. And so when you're playing it in tune, it's like boing, poking a little up in a diagonal way. And then you can pull back on the bar and make the string tension, go wing a little bit. But there's a lot of limitations there. So let's go back to Steve Vai's narrative, where he says, I wanted to have a whammy bar that could pull the strings really sharp, not just one tone or half a tone, which is talking about like one white key on the piano to the next white key on the piano, or a white key to a black key on the piano, right? I had never seen anything that could do what I wanted, so I just looked at the guitar, looked at it carefully, and thought, what's stopping this tremolo from going really sharp? It was just the wood in the body that the bridge was sitting on. So I took a hammer and a screwdriver and I banged out the wood, pieces flying everywhere. That was it. And then I was able to pull way up and the notes would go a fifth, a sixth. I could even snap the strings. That was party time for me. Now, Vai then goes to custom guitar makers and has them replicate this, process without a screwdriver and a hammer necessarily. But they carved for him a lion's claw cavity behind the bridge of his guitar. And that is like, if you ever see the cavities on some of his, gem guitars, it's not just like they routed out a like swimming pool shaped rectangle underneath the bridge. They carved out specifically 6 channels under the 6 string area where that part of the bridge mechanism kind of pokes down. So it's very, I don't know, aerodynamic looking in an inverse way, but it's sort of it's like a seashell kind of pattern. And it, to their credit, that design leaves as much wood on the body as possible, right? And that's a debate for someone else that cares to debate it. How much of your tone comes from the body mass of the wood on your guitar. Now, another thing he decided he needed was 24 frets on the neck instead of the standard 22. That gives you 2 octaves reach on the fretboard. It's like putting extra keys on the end of a piano, except for the piano already has a multi-octave range that obviously blows away a guitar. I didn't realize that Steve Vai was responsible for this. This in 1991, when I started buying guitar magazines, there were like ads from Fernandez, saying, "Hey, 24 fret neck. That's something you can't live without." And as a kid, I'm like, I don't know how many frets my guitar has. Why do I need 24? I think the ad copy insinuated something like, if you don't know why, then you're dumb. Or it should be understood that you need 24 frets, God damn it. Now, the cutaway on the guitar is the part where your left hand comes up against the body and you want to be able to reach over to the fretboard and play the high notes, right? That's the little scoop out of the one side of the front of a Les Paul. That's the scoop out of a Telecaster on that one treble side. And in the Stratocaster, there's two cutaways, one on either side. The Gibson SG has two cutaways, one on either side. And at this time, Vai says, I never understood the cutaways on most guitars. It's pretty uncomfortable to play high up on Strats and Les Pauls, at least with my big hands. You can't get up there and squeeze those notes without having wood in your way. And there's the shape. I like Stratocasters, but they were visually a little too pedestrian. They weren't sexy enough. And I couldn't sit with a Les Paul. They were always off to the side or they hung funny. So I had Performance Guitar Shop sharpen the edges of a Strat-style guitar a bit and round off certain areas that I thought would feel good. And the finished body looked great to me. Now that would be enough, I think, to solidify Vai's place in the Guitar Modification Hall of Fame, having done so much to build on what Eddie Van Halen had done. But there's even more. And I had no idea that he is the man that's responsible for all these changes. He understood why people liked double humbucker guitars in like the Gibsons and stuff. And I guess I should say something about humbuckers versus single coils. For the folks that don't know, a single coil, really quickly, is just a quieter, snappier sounding guitar tone. A humbucker is two single coils wired together, generally in a series. So your signal is going through one coil and then the other coil of wire that makes the overall guitar sound louder when you play, but quieter when you're not. If you want to get into it deeper, you certainly can. There's a lot to read about when it comes to that stuff. But the basics are electric guitar string is plucked, and the vibration of that string interrupts the magnetic field of what's called a pickup, which is a series of magnets with copper wire wrapped around them. And the strength of the magnet versus the gauge of the coil of wire and the length of the number of coils will change how your guitar sounds very dramatically. So think single coil, think lots of country music, fast picking stuff, think Buddy Holly. Yes, Jimi Hendrix played a single coil guitar too, but he radically altered the sound of it with electronics after the fact. Humbuckers, think Slash from Guns N' Roses, think the Who, Won't Get Fooled Again. Think AC/DC, any single song they play. Think of the big huge sounding chords from those bands. Stevie Ray Vaughan would not have sounded like Stevie Ray Vaughan if he did not play Fender Stratocasters with single coil pickups in them. I'll put it that way. They are snappier. They have a thump to them. They have a lot of clarity. But humbuckers can handle distortion in a much different way. And they are a little grindier and overall louder with more of a balance in the EQ spectrum. They're not like sparkling highs and then clear low ends of the EQ. They have a tendency to have more mid-range to them and more balance all the way across. That's all I'm going to get into. Everyone that already knows what I'm talking about, you've been very nice to sit through this. But Vai decides he doesn't want to live with this binary choice. He wants to incorporate a single coil in between two humbuckers. So then he gets the really raunchy sounds of, the humbucker distortion and the, brightness of a bridge pickup that's really crunchy. And then he gets like a smoother neck pickup, bassy sound. But then in the middle, he can either play a single coil by itself or combine it with those two humbuckers on each side of it to get a really clean, glassy, kind of great for clean arpeggio picking kind of sounds that, Stratocaster players are used to when they combine, their middle pickup with something or, play it by itself. This became standard. All these designs that he's coming up with were just standard on guitars that metal players played by the time, your 1989, 1990, 1991 comes around. He also decided he was tired of the danger of accidentally unplugging yourself being ever present. No more output jack with the cable coming out of your guitar through a plate in the front or a plate in the side of the guitar, or just a hole drilled there. He wants a recessed jack up into the back of the guitar body, so that you just don't have as many chances to step on your cable and unplug yourself, or bend that output jack by stepping on your cable, or splinter the wood in the front of your guitar if you're playing a hollow body or an SG. It's just going to crack that. So he is the guy that seems to be most responsible for alleviating that issue. Drill a little hole into the side of the edge of the back part of the guitar, put the jack in there, so when you plug it in, the plug is actually disappearing partially into the body of the guitar itself, not sticking out like an antenna. And I really want to get into what happens after he gets these things incorporated into his guitars from the performance guitar guys, and then finds the folks at Ibanez. I don't know if we'll have time. I'll get into Ibanez later if this episode doesn't just get too long. You know what? I think I'm going to have to put out another episode just to sort of buy myself more time to make this one as long as I want to. Bear with me, folks. Thank you for being here, by the way. Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate you giving a damn about any of this stuff. I need to go take a walk and listen to Lucretia, My Reflection by Sisters of Mercy, and go to the local pub and have chicken fried steak now. Update for transparency. I did not have chicken fried steak. I had a pizza. Still a good walk, though. Hope you have a good walk today at some point. If only just to build up the power in your posterior. Well, let's talk about Yngwie now. I personally have always been impressed by everything I've heard by Yngwie Malmsteen. It's a bit much to the ears of someone like me who's used to more songwriting-oriented music with guitar solos in it. But I gotta say, my bias kind of is that I appreciate more his picking style and his approach to the notes and the note choices and the arpeggios and the fury of it all that he unleashes on the fretboard, as opposed to someone who's really smooth, as opposed to someone who has a lot of like legato and tapping and things like that. I also like Ritchie Blackmore a lot. I like that overdriven Stratocaster turned up way loud and picked aggressively. But Yngwie took all the blues playing out of it. That's one of the keys to, in my mind, like the history of shred guitar, like a very important watershed moment is, it's the same thing that punk rock did. Punk rock took the blues out of rock and roll and made it faster and louder, and that's what it was all about. Removing the guitar solos, removing, a lot of the bending. That, I'm speaking in generalities here, but if we're talking about the Sex Pistols and the Ramones, and some of their ilk, the Clash. Yngwie took blues playing out of the guitar solo game and injected it with Paganini and Bach. Alex Skolnick of Testament says, Yngwie had the classical feel, but he upped the technique level significantly. With Randy Rhoads, you could hear the Bach influence as well as hard rock. He listened to a lot of the standard hard rock, somebody growing up in the 60s and 70s. But Yngwie Malmsteen brought this mystique as well as a Paganini or a Liszt, one of these classical virtuosos that is rumored to have sold their soul. He brought that to the guitar, which was very different at the time. Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins says, Malmsteen is different in that he came from the Ritchie Blackmore school of diminished minor. Even Malmsteen, he benefited from a generation that had already grown up on... For me, it's hard. Because if you're starting from the point of the 80s, Van Halen is already 3, 4, 5 years in. To me, I don't put those guys, Eddie, Randy, Yngwie, as equals in the sense that I think it's easier to come after somebody. I'm sure Yngwie Malmsteen would say he didn't give a shit about Eddie Van Halen, and maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. And you can make an argument that he lived in a bubble and only listened to the guys he listened to, starting with Blackmore and obviously Uli John Roth, maybe some Michael Schenker. That's tough for me because when somebody else follows 5 or 7 years later, the game of figuring it out is infinitely easier. There's a great anecdote in here from Kirk Hammett of Metallica, and instantly a lot of you guys are going, bleh, but shut up. He says, you have to understand, with Yngwie, it was a very unique situation. I don't think that a lot of people know this, but I first heard Yngwie on the same tape trading circuit as No Life Till Leather, which is the Metallica demo that was duplicated 1 million times and mailed to people all over the world through this underground network of tape trading folks that would meet each other via ads or it's almost like personal ads in the back of rock magazines, underground metal fanzines and stuff. And like, hey, I've got tapes of all these shows or all these bands. If you want to trade, send me send a postcard or whatever. Or, my mailbox, my P.O. box is this. And, people would basically just like, oh, okay, you gave me these four bootleg tapes. I'll give you these 4 bootleg tapes. And that's how Metallica really got a international following before they were, able to tour the world. And it helped them obviously get a record deal in New Jersey. So Kirk's talking about the No Life Till Leather demo and the Exodus demo that he had played on before he joined Metallica. Because like Kirk wasn't on No Life Till Leather. It was Dave Mustaine at that time. I know 80% of you already know this. I heard Yngwie's first demo before he was signed, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, oh my God, this guy sounds like Ulrich Roth. I remember bringing that very tape to Joe Satriani because he was taking lessons from Joe at the time and would take lessons from him again later. He says, I played it for Joe, and he said, wow, this guy's really something. He has a lot of technique, and he really knows what he's doing. And then there was this guy in the store, someone who's kind of infamous. His name is Gary Brouwer, who used to work at the same store. He sets up all my guitars and a lot of guitars for a lot of musicians. He works in San Francisco. Anyway, Gary piped in with, is he speeding up the tape? And Joe said, no, he's not speeding up the tape. He's playing that in real time. The only other person I knew who could play like Yngwie at the time was Joe. And I think Joe prided himself on being one of the people who could play that way. But when Joe heard Yngwie, I think the awareness came that there was this guy. And it was like, all right, we're going to be hearing a lot from him in the future. Also, Yngwie's influence on me was that he sounded like Ulrich Roth. And I love the fact that he sounded like Ulrich Roth. He sounded like Ritchie Blackmore to a certain extent. What blew me away is the public knowledge that he was only 19 years old at the time. So for me to hear someone my age playing that way, completely influenced by the same people I was influenced by, really blew me away. Again, it just really inspired me to play much more. I can hear the jokes you guys are thinking up in your head right now about Kirk. You're mean. You're mean people. I was always very, very careful, like I was with a lot of other influences, not to consciously play like him. I can hear more jokes in your head right now. Not to start playing tons of arpeggios and 30-second notes, a neoclassical style. I mean, a lot of guys jumped on that and sponged off his style, but I consciously did not go there. Some really good notes from Michelangelo Battio from the band Nitro, and of course, as a solo artist. He says, I was at Yngwie's very first show in the United States with Mike Varney. I'm a little older than Yngwie, and I didn't move to LA until 83, but I was on Shrapnel Records in 1982 with an album called US Metal. He did 3 US Metal albums. I was on the second one. But when I went to see Yngwie, I had already had my style down. I have a degree in music, so I studied orchestral music, and when they called him neoclassical, I always used to think that term was wrong. He was more of a Baroque-style guitarist in the style of Bach and Vivaldi, whereas classical music is more in the style of Mozart. The classical era is Mozart and Haydn. So I always thought the term was incorrect. But seeing Yngwie for the first time was really incredible. I saw him with Steeler. I was backstage, and it was great. There was a huge buzz because he took that Randy Rhoads kind of classical influence and put his technique to it that I was playing, the kind of serious violin-style technique. I always had that great technique on guitar, and I studied jazz and fusion and things like that, so it was a fantastic time. getting a little pump for himself there at the end. Michelangelo Battio, who has made an appearance on a Red Letter Media Best of the Worst episode because of a 80s shock horror movie thing he did. I think it might be Shock 'Em Dead. I think he was the lead guitarist in the band summoned by the evil powers of the main character once he gets his evil wish to be a villainous rock star. Michael is filmed doing his whole two guitar neck playing at the same time deal. Jas Obrecht says when he first saw Yngwie play, he had just been brought over to the United States by Mike Varney, owner of Shrapnel Records. Yngwie was making his debut with either Steeler or Alcatraz. As I watched, I thought it was a clear case of $10 band with $1 million guitarist. After the show, Yngwie, who was all of about 18 years old, came right up to me backstage and said, "I know you. You're Jas Obrecht. Back in Sweden, I learned English by reading your magazine." I gave him a kind of a, yeah, sure, look. Yngwie continued, adamant, "No bullshit, man. In the September 1980 B.B. King issue, you're the guy in the T-shirt on page 71. The magazine's photographer, John Sievert, and I stood there with our mouths agape when Yngwie said this. When we went back to the office, we checked. Sure enough, he was right down to the page number." How much of an asshole do you have to be to go, "Yeah, right, buddy," when they give you credit for something? When they say, "I'm a big fan of your," you're not a big enough fan of me to have read my words and learned English from them, Yngwie Malmsteen. How dare you pull this bullshit on a hugely powerful, influential person like me? I've seen it all and done it all, and I don't believe your bullshit story. Jesus. Fucking journalists, man. If you haven't listened to my other episodes, you don't know how many tirades I've gone off on. Mike Varney will also note later in the book that Yngwie made a huge splash, and part of it is because kind of the way Metallica broke. I was in touch with a lot of the metal magazines and a lot of guitar fans around the world. The word got out on Yngwie pretty quickly when we started spreading it out through the underground. It was kind of funny, the word of mouth thing. Like Metallica had a huge tape trading fan base that they kind of built up. And there's this magazine called Metal Mania in San Francisco. Metal Mania is the source of the name Metallica because Ron Quintana was friends with Lars Ulrich, and he had like a list of 10 prospective names that he dreamed up for his heavy metal fanzine, and one of them was Metallica, and Lars like stole it and said, "Oh yeah, call yourself Metal Mania," and then took off with the other one. It was the first to really help get Metallica solidified in the underground. And they also put Yngwie on the cover of their magazine. I think before he even got going, when I just started working with him, they jumped on it right away. And this, they said, is the new guy. Jas Obrecht says, after paying his dues in Alcatraz, Yngwie made his enduring mark on music with his brilliant debut album, Rising Force. His shows in support of the album, at least in San Francisco, were sheer pandemonium. Guys were stage diving. Mosh pit was as intense as any I'd seen. And the manager had a semi-automatic pistol strapped on underneath his sports jacket. Now, I don't know if he means Yngwie's road manager or the manager of the venue. I don't know. I don't know if you have a manager of venues, do you? Do people? Yeah, you have. Yeah, you have to. Clubs have managers, unless we're talking about a theater show. The vibe was intense. It didn't take long for Yngwie to fall prey to some of the excesses of big-time rock and roll, though. Ultimately, he injured himself in a car crash in 1987, which slowed his career for a year or two. For my part, I personally would read all the books ever about Yngwie's rock and roll excesses and never get bored. But there aren't any, unfortunately. Marty Friedman says, Yngwie's the guy I know the least about, believe it or not. I just never was a big Bach mixing classical with rock type of guy. I never was a Deep Purple Jimi Hendrix guy. I read that quote not to educate anyone on Yngwie Malmsteen and his influence, but simply to point out that Marty Friedman just explained why I don't like Marty Friedman's playing to me just now. I'll close out this section with some words from the big man himself, Steve Vai. He says, it wasn't until Yngwie hit the scene that shredding, the concept of deep, masterful, virtuosic control on the instrument, reached a new level. As far as electric guitar playing goes, it was Yngwie. Like the music or not, you have to pay honor to what he did, because he showed us what was capable. I assume that was the choice of word is weird there at the end. I don't know if that's a misprint, and it's like missing a word in a phrase, or like showed us what you could be capable of, or showed us what was reachable, or showed us what was possible. So I think as far as shredding guitarists go, Eddie and Yngwie are very different players, but they both made a major contribution to the virtuosic bar in guitar playing. That's my feeling. Randy had an impact, but I think as far as sheer terrorizing speed, Yngwie. Now that was going to round out my main Yngwie portion of this episode, but then the day after I recorded that segment you just got done listening to, I flipped over to YouTube and got fed in my feed an episode of a new program called Yngwie Malmsteen's Coffee Talk, Episode 1, Steve Vai. What? It's the two guys, and they're having a nice little conversation. It's very, very, very cool. Yngwie's in his studio, and I can't tell where Steve is because his head like takes up the whole frame. Steve's very agreeable, structurally agreeable, angular, symmetric face is well cropped into the screen, whereas Yngwie is like playing a guitar, sitting on a swivel chair and stuff, and showing off his rad sideburns that still are so dark, so dark for his age. Maybe he's born with it. Maybe it's boot polish. Maybe it's black leather pants polish. And while I'm recommending you check out things on YouTube of guitarists talking, I also wanted to say, for those of you that were like, why did you read any quote from Billy Corgan in this episode? Why would we care what he has to say? I am very impressed with him when it comes to the knowledge and information and experience that he put out there conversationally on his episode of Joe Rogan Experience he showed up on. Don't give me shit. I watch a couple of Joe Rogans now and then if they have a couple of comedians that I like on or a couple of musicians I like on. And he breaks down things about the music industry that nobody of his age or older has ever managed to do so succinctly and so well. Doesn't matter if you like him or not. I don't like any of his music, really. I had it shoved down my throat in high school in the 90s and never caught on with me. But I would hang out with that guy all day long. He's got some killer stories about hanging out with Dennis Rodman, too. And they own a wrestling company. I mean, Dixie Carter or Jeff Jarrett or whoever it was took him to the cleaners, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Don't sue me. But I watched most of that episode with him and loved everything he said up until the point where he was talking about how he created this fun little game in the 90s when he was getting really popular and hugely sought after as far as being interviewed and stuff. And he would like work. He was kind of getting into the whole pro wrestling idea of like working a crowd, working a certain series of interviews like he was playing a character. And he intentionally played up being dumber than he actually was in a Kaufman-esque sort of way. He was the one kind of playing a trick on the person interviewing him, and they were putting out these stories about what a dumb guy he was because he intentionally wanted to manipulate the conversation that way. But he gets sort of on his high horse about saying, but those same people that want to believe I was really that dumb, aren't going to give me credit for when I'm, my normal self, when I'm acting, smarter than that, essentially. I'm paraphrasing him. But that was the douchiest thing I'd heard in a long time. It's just like, wait. The reason Andy Kaufman worked was because he didn't care what anybody thought of him. He, as a performer, existed at that point in his career to make people uncomfortable and to provoke them into having reactions sort of against their will. And no matter what happened, and he would push it as far as he could. I mean, to the point of provoking people to react violently toward him. You got to commit to that. You don't lament the fact that people don't think you're a smart guy when you intentionally go out there and pretend to be a dumb guy. That's not how the game pays off for anybody. And I just love that complaint. I love that complaint that, people that I convinced I was dumb just don't give me credit for being smart. Yeah, Billy, that's how it works. I convinced everybody at my family Thanksgiving dinner that I was vegan and nobody offered me a drumstick from the turkey. If I said that to you, you would tell me I was the biggest asshole in the entire world, wouldn't you? I mean, I would deserve that. You should tell me that. Weren't we talking about guitar playing? Oh, and to answer Brian and Dan's question from another part of this episode, and I've edited it so much I don't know if it's before this or after this now. And it happens when they're looking at the cover of a guitar magazine and they can identify every single person except for one. And who was it? Who was the one that got away? Well, I'll tell you. James Mankey from Washington State, it turns out, where we are from. Co-founder, longtime guitarist of Concrete Blonde, also played on the first 2 albums by the band Sparks. A scene from Scrooged comes to mind, written by Michael O'Donoghue. What was the name of the boat that took them all to Gilligan's Island? The SS Minnow, James. Ha ha! Hey, if you're enjoying the show so far, and if you've enjoyed other episodes of this program, I would like to just take a moment to let you know that we have no sponsors that I know of as of today. We have no patrons. We don't have any sort of structured, tiered sort of system for people to subscribe via throwing money at me. I do this all in my free time when I'm not working a day job that is not musical or fun in any way. And if you would like to support what I'm doing, I don't even have to beg you for money. You can go to the link in the description that takes you to my series of other endeavors or ways you can financially support. You could buy one of the inspirational shirts that I've created that says wonderful phrases that will brighten up the day of the people that you see at the grocery store. Phrases like, "It's over," or "With God's help, I may just die tonight while crawling to the toilet," or "Live for status and die a jealous, paranoid failure." All with very, very pleasing designs on them. You can also give money via the PayPal link there directly to me. I will love it, and I will use that to buy more variations of black tea and more books that I use for reference material on this podcast. You could also do something as simple as following me on Twitter, RockFilmRock, or Instagram at Just the Worst Ever. More than anything, I would just love it if you would tell someone you know about this podcast via social media or one-to-one communication. It's not for everybody. It's not for most people if we're doing, ourselves the service of living an honest life in our words and deeds. But if you know that one person in a million that might actually enjoy some of the subjects that we've talked about on this program, I would love it if you share this with them because it might brighten their day, might give them a break from all the other podcasts that either are very slick and highly produced and biased towards whatever point of view some corporation is trying to get out there, or they just sound like 3 middle-aged white loafs that have watched Star Wars too many times talking about pop culture. God help us all. As someone much smarter than me on Twitter today said, most podcasts sound like if all 3 of the guys at Red Letter Media were Josh talking in the same room. If you don't understand that reference, congratulations. I wish I was you. Now enough of that to-do and falderall. Let's get back to the fun. From the article entitled "An API Board and an A&R Bozo" by Joe Gore, I shall now read. Bask in my immense audiobook narration talents. Both of Steve Vai's solo albums were recorded entirely in his personal studios. But as Steve metamorphosed from cult figure to well-paid guitar god, his setup grew accordingly. I recorded Flexible at Stucco Blue, he recalls, which was just 2 small rooms with an 8-track machine and a little carving board. The tracks to Blue Powder, Answers, and Erotic Nightmares, and the drum machine track for Love Secrets were also recorded there, but on 24 tracks. The rest of the tracks for Passion and Warfare were done in my Hollywood studio on 48 tracks with an old 24-track 3M machine synced to a 24-track studio. I have a completely rebuilt API board with 40 channels of Massenberg automation. It's a great console. It's totally discreet with a clean sound. You can really pump lots of EQ. And when you add a serious bottom end, it doesn't squash or get woolly. The principal guitars at Passion and Warfare were Steve's Black Ibanez 7-string, a floral pattern gem, and an old Tom Anderson instrument with smatterings of choral electric sitar and guild acoustic. The amps were Marshalls all the way, except for Blue Powder, which was originally recorded for a Carvin amp ad on the B-side of the October 1986 Guitar Player's sound page. Most of the material was assembled on an Apple Macintosh computer using Mark of the Unicorn's performer sequencing software in conjunction with a Korg M1 keyboard and Roland Kurzweil samplers. It was incredibly time-consuming, groans Steve. If there are 12 horns playing a passage, every single pitch was typed in, knew it by knew it. And everything was performed to a click track. A crucial piece of gear was Eventide's HD 3000 Ultra Harmonizer, a digital processing module with highly sophisticated pitch-changing capabilities. I used the HD 3000 on almost everything. It's a great unit, raves Vai. I sat for 3 solid days and went through all the presets on the prototype. I made a cassette of hundreds of short pieces of music, and 2 of them, Ballerina and Alian Waterkiss, ended up on the record. I wrote 50 presets, and you can get them when you buy the unit. Vai and his engineer assistant, Pascal Fillet, maintain a brittle mixing schedule. We were working around the clock, he claims. I learned that your body can adjust to sleeping 2 hours every night. So I would wake up at 10 or 11 at night and work all the way through. Those were my favorite hours. There were no phone calls. And as if that weren't cruel enough, the guitarist was administered massive doses of frustration by his record label after the album was completed. I was still signed to Capitol Records through a deal that had taken place when I was with Alcatraz. Notes Vai. The label asked me back then if I wanted to do a solo album, but then I joined David Lee Roth, and he didn't want me to release the record and I didn't have the time. Anyway, I went to the president of Capitol and told him I wouldn't be able to do the record properly. He gave me a release out of that deal on the contingency that if I, and when I left Roth, I would take the record to Capitol. So I finished my record. I paid for it all myself. Even built the studio and said to Capitol, here's the record. Pay me. But they didn't want to know the record from Adam. My old A&R guy had been fired on my new guy. Remember, he's the one. He's the one who is supposed to work with the artist and be the liaison between him and the label. Not only didn't know that I was signed to his label. He didn't even know. I was. Then they tried to cut my budget back after they signed the deal. They said, look, we'll put it out, but there's not going to be a promotion involved. I got off the label, thank God, and Relativity is going to be distributing the record. They're the ones who did the production and the distribution for Flexible. And they've sold close to 200,000 copies in the record industry these days. Gut Instinct is dead. They work by formula, which is a shame, because there are people out there making great music who will never be heard.
Yeah. So yeah.
Right, so we're setting up. So we're setting up. The timeline is from where. So with McLaughlin starts in what the early.
All
70s?
that stuff was like all that shit was pre Van Halen.
Yeah.
So like your question initially was what happened post? What was the post Van Halen explosion of
But
Shred?
I'm glad you took me back instead.
Because
but
there was,
also you
that
have
was leading up to it because there was
Yeah.
some shit that happened before that was legit shit.
Right.
I mean, like Van
Everybody
Halen was not like the Messiah that everyone think. He did unique stuff and did it in a unique way and made it and was effortless. I mean, he was like an idiot savant. It was amazing to see him live do that because it was stupid.
and he's grinning and it's just
yeah.
easy for him.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like
And it was like that every time.
he's just fun. He's having fun, and he's just destroying worlds. And just smiling and grinning and smoking a cigarette and just being like, "Yeah, no, I don't know. I'm just better than everybody else. I just woke up this way."
And legit, he always said, "Well, my guy is Clapton."
Yeah,
And you're like, "Well, that doesn't help me figure anything out."
that's not
Right.
Like I went back and listened to Cloud. Like I remember reading that in one of these magazines when I'm like 13 years old and going back and listening to Cloud and being like, "No,
Yeah.
Which
That's
also
nothing. We're not even close."
falls
No.
in line with his sort of like, "Oh, well, here's what I do to my Marshalls," and then the guy that like hot rods his Marshalls is like, "That's not what he does." and then he's like, "Well, I boil all my strings," and then his guitar tech is like, "I've never boiled a single string for Eddie Van Halen."
Well,
And
I actually put Energizer batteries in all of his shit. Yeah. Eric Johnson.
Only Eric Johnson comes and steals them.
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Because he wants to know what it's
Well,
like to be a non-Duracell fuzz pedal player for one day.
Right, exactly.
What happened was Eddie Van Halen's
his
tech
octopedal.
was on Eric Johnson's payroll, and Eddie Van Halen would use his batteries, and Eric Johnson only wanted them when they were like 68%.
Right.
Right.
That they didn't sound good if they were less or more than 68%.
Well, right.
That was the
So
thing
he would-
Dwayne Allman actually did do too.
And they had to be Eddie Van Halen's batteries, or they didn't sound right.
he didn't have access to those.
He had to
but yeah.
use 34%, 32%. I don't know math.
He used math percent.
I mean, it was metric.
number.
He wanted metric,
It was metric
voltage.
percentage.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I actually just looked at it.
We're not
I got
good
a-
at this.
I got a brand new comment on a fucking YouTube video I have of me reading Hunter S. Thompson, and some lady's like, "I really liked your comment about Dwayne Allman," and I'm like, "I don't fucking remember what I said about Dwayne Allman." Because I was reading it like out of a book, and then I made a bunch of asides to like fill time.
Right.
And I must have said something about Dwayne Allman that related to Ruben Salazar being murdered in L.A. in 1981. Fuck, why did that lead me to Dwayne? I'm not going to go back and listen to myself.
Right.
Find out.
How would you end up at Dwayne Allman?
But legit, this is
Eat
just
a
a side
peach.
note. Dwayne Allman did put like half-dead batteries in his fuzz pedals when he played slide. Like that was a thing he liked. And I remember reading that like Eric Johnson likes Duracell batteries in his fuzz pedals, not Energizer batteries.
Right, because fuck Energizer.
Yep.
Yeah. And
There goes my Energizer endorsement. God
So,
damn it.
man.
I realize we've gotten this far in the episode without talking that much about the actual making of the movie Crossroads. And this is an episode of the history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll, not the history of rock and roll in rock and roll. That's some other Codpast program you can check out somewhere. Now, the last time we did Crossroads, I talked about the making of the film, the writing, the origins of the story idea, the mythology, Papa Legba, Voodoo, Hoodoo, Robert Johnson, all kinds of fun stuff. But I intentionally stayed away from the guitar duel at the end. Intentionally stayed away from Steve Vai because I knew I wanted to build on a whole big, look back at the 80s shred guitar thing, and it was going to be a deep dive. And it would start with some White Claws with my friends Brian and Dan. Now, let's get into the guitar playing on the film. Besides just Steve Vai, we're going to get into a bit about Arlen Roth. But let's talk about the duel. Let's talk about Vai. Let's talk about like Ralph Macchio a little bit too. It says in AmericanBluesScene.com's article, 10 things you didn't know about the film Crossroads. I'm not going to read all 10 things, obviously, just the ones that are specific to this part of the conversation. It says, in the film's decisive scene, Lightning Boy, which is Ralph Macchio's Karate Kid character with a Fender Telecaster, stands in for Willie Brown to cut heads against Jack Butler. The outcome would be nothing less than Willie's and Eugene's immortal souls. I think the outcome... What? The prize upon the outcome, I guess. Well, all right, fine, whatever. Jack Butler, described by Scratch, formerly Papa Legba, discourages a lot of up-and-coming boys. And therefore had to be somebody with major chops. The final choice, as we all know, was virtuoso rock guitarist Steve Vai, but there were plenty of other players that wanted that part. Now, quoting the screenwriter, Mr. Fusco, once again, I wish I had more insight into the final choice was made. Again, I was a 24-year-old former bar musician being told that Jimmy Page, Johnny Winter, and Keith Richards all wanted to play a role that I created. Hold on to that thought. We're going to add to that list in a little bit. Ry Cooder, who did a large part of the soundtrack, the slide playing and the blues, acoustic blues kind of picking stuff, and Walter Hill, who's the director, were very secretive about this particular process. I remember getting a phone call that a decision was made and locked and that it would be Steve Vai. I admit that I was thrown and confused, but it all became clear very quickly that Ry knew what he was doing, and it was the best choice of all. I ran into Jimmy Page in a bar in the West Indies years later. True story. He told me how badly he wanted that role. We hung out for days, and he played his acoustic guitar in me and my wife's cabana and while he was writing new songs. According to the film's musical consultant, Arlen Roth, here we go. Both Frank Zappa and Stevie Ray Vaughan were briefly considered as well. This makes me think, how much cooler would that whole last part of the movie been if there were like 4 or 5 guys tearing through the competition instead of just one? Except for the fact that we would have to suspend a lot of disbelief that the character of Eugene could actually beat all of them. There are some technical details about the whole climactic guitar duel between Eugene and Jack Butler. Originally, it was intended to be only a slide guitar contest, just a blues playing slide contest with Ry Cooder appearing on screen as the character of Jack Butler. And then Arlen Roth would play Eugene's parts. Walter Hill, the director, decided to replace Cooder and produce a harder boxing match style battle with, originally in his mind, Keith Richards, Frank Zappa, and Stevie Ray Vaughan considered for the part of Butler, each individually, settling obviously on Steve Vai as because of what he'd heard from his playing in Alcatraz, and thinking that, you know, it being the mid '80s, a more fashionable shred style guitar would increase the film's appeal to a wider audience. Ry Cooder, of course, is disappointed in this choice, but from at least according to this source, which is not the blues, it's not the blues website. It's I think it's ultimateguitar.com or Guitar World. I've lost track. And he and Roth felt the use of a contemporary musical style was not in keeping with the movie's blues theme, and it would badly date the film later. The director shot an additional duel, which was to appear before the final confrontation. This pitted Steve Vai's Jack Butler against a blues player portrayed by Shuggie Otis. Otis was to lose this, establishing how threatening Butler was. That would be pretty cool to see, I think, too, to see Jack Butler like tearing through guys, much more experienced than Eugene, you know, and watch. I don't know if that was intended to be a thing that like Eugene could witness or not, but obviously the audience was going to. Eugene ends up winning by playing a neoclassical sort of composition called Eugene's Trick Bag. If you ever want to look it up, quotes heavily from violin virtuoso Niccolo Paganini's Caprice No. 5. This reprises parts from the classical playing that William Cannongeiser had dubbed for Eugene at the film's beginning. He's the guitarist on the movie Crossroads that did all the acoustic classical style stuff and obviously electric classical style stuff on Ralph Macchio's behalf. Except for the parts of the final duel where Steve Vai dubs in Eugene's Trick Bag, which Macchio is miming on the Telecaster. Also a note about the red Superstrat guitar that Jack Butler plays on screen. That was, I guess, a bit of a mystery for a long time. As we discussed earlier in this episode, there was a period of time between his Fender Strat playing and his Ibanez playing. Steve Vai was getting guitars straight from Grover Jackson or Mike Shannon at Charvel, okay, with DiMarzio pickups and Floyd Rose trems in them. This is a guitar from that period of time. This was Vai's own guitar, and because of the fact that they knew that he would have to drop it on the ground very angrily or despondently, the production team had to work really hard, really fast to create mock-up instruments for that one particular shot where it hits the floor. Now, this article says the original guitar, signed by Steve Vai himself, is now in the collection of the Hard Rock Cafe. I assume they mean the one that he played, not the dummies that were dropped on the ground. But I don't know. I hate to say it. I was insecure enough to go look up these lines that I had cribbed from the internet, and these facts are from the Wikipedia entry in about Crossroads, the 1986 film. Apparently, I didn't give myself a little link to that in my notes like I usually do. Maybe I thought it would be very obvious by the layout and the formatting. Let's see. This is all stuff that I was, collecting months and months ago. Interesting note about the soundtrack album. Let's say you went to the movie theater in 1986 and were one of the few people that saw and loved this film as it happened in real time. And you decide, I'm going to go to a record store or a compact disc store or a cassette tape store, and plunk down my hard-earned money to have the soundtrack for this film, Crossroads, that features some amazing guitar work by Mr. Steve Vai and some great classical playing as well. Well, the soundtrack featured 37 minutes of the film's music, but does not feature Eugene's classical playing, performed by the aforementioned William Kanengeiser, nor does it feature the final duel with Jack Butler. His playing on that, including the duel, is featured on The Elusive Light and Sound, Volume 1, released by Vai himself. So he had possession. Sorry, I just flashed back to a Robert Johnson song called If I Had Possession Over Judgment Day. Excuse me. Vai had possession, apparently, over that whole composition and recording to release on his own. Good for him. Now, having watched the movie for the first time since I got my, Robert Johnson obsession on back in 1997, it strikes me that this is not the kind of thing that makes inexperienced young people decide, I have to get a guitar tomorrow so I can start playing like Steve Vai. I'm sure it had that effect on a lot of people that were like, yep, I'm going to be the guy that does that. But for the most part, I think it would just be like, hey, here's an alien in human form playing a guitar. And he's amazing. Unlike, let's say, Back to the Future. When I was a kid in 85, that was the movie that made me and some of my best friends, as I got older, I would find out, obsessed with guitar. As something more rock and roll, we could physically start doing, right? By the way, it just turns out Ralph Macchio passed on the role of Marty in Back to the Future in order to do Crossroads. Not that he would have necessarily got the role. Who knows? Maybe he was asked back for like a third audition or something. It was given to the guy from Mask first, the guy from Prophecy, the guy, Pulp Fiction, ginger guy. Do not be bringing some fucked up poop out to my house, all right? I don't know you. Who is this? Prank caller. That guy. He was Marty McFly originally, then it didn't work out. After a couple of test runs, they ended up going with Michael J. Fox, as we all know. One little detail about the whole duking it out scene at the end of the film, the people that are in the bar during the duel, in the barrel house or the roadhouse or the barn or whatever it is, they're all dressed for a funeral. I did not catch that when I watched it for the first time as a person in his late teens in 1997. Another thing I will actually say about that the audio that goes with the video, the licks that Eugene plays do sound like they might actually be coming out of a Fender Telecaster. It is nice. They didn't put some like non-bluesy new thing on that. They didn't make it sound 80s. They made him sound like he was playing the guitar he was pictured with, and they used Steve Vai's real sound of his real rig. So Steve Vai at this time, he was around about 27 years old because he had joined Zappa's band when he was 20 back in 1980. So he's 26-ish, 27. He said this was a dark time in his life. He was very willing and able to project a dark aura. He discovered that it was having a detrimental effect on his mental and physical health, and he actually spiraled into a black hole. Fortunately for me, he says, I was able to claw my way out after several years. During the filming of Crossroads, he says, I allowed that aura to permeate me once again. It was difficult because it's easy to be sucked back into that way of thinking and behaving again. The music was more or less secondary to the attitude. I don't usually go to that particular place very much anymore. You become what you create. And in those days, I was creating a lot of dark stuff. It was an honor to have worked with Ry Cooder. He is a truly brilliant and talented man in a very earthy way. Being a part of a movie was a hoot. I had a lot of fun with Arlen Roth. The movie's like a snapshot for me of a particular time in my life. I was growing at a fast rate and was luckily surrounded by great people. One fact I learned was that the guitar duel was originally supposed to be, or envisioned to be by the musicians, about 15 minutes long. and edited down to just the last 2 minutes or so to heighten the impact of the scene. The whole final duel was a collaboration musically between Steve Vai, Ry Cooder, and Bill Cannon's, Kanan Geyser. Sorry, I apologize to the German people or whoever. And there was some weird contract dispute that led to Arlen Roth not being credited in the movie itself and in the credits of the film. So let me read a bit from Arlen Roth's website. He doesn't really come clean about what happened, unfortunately, and it's very frustrating that he doesn't sort of blow the lid off that. I would think that enough time has passed by now that we could know what was going on. I'm picking up where I left off on the last episode because I did read a lot of Arlen Roth's account of the making of the film as it relates more to the blues aspect. But at this part of his narrative, I wanted to save everything I saw and was reading for this episode. After the many weeks of amazing times in Mississippi, we had to go back to L.A. We continued to shoot on sets that were built to retain the continuity of the scenes we shot on location in Mississippi. This included the Steve Vai ending, which is quite controversial, since I was also hired as a musical consultant for the film. In an overall sense, I was totally against having Vai in this scene. We had already recorded the original ending duel, and it was much more true to script slide guitar duel between me and Ry Cooder. You can imagine how great that sounded. It was a movie about the blues, not heavy metal, and I was furious that the film's producers and directors were giving in to this mid-'80s heavy metal hair band nonsense. They would say to me, "But Arlen, this is 1985." You know, talking like pre-production and production. Obviously came out in 86. And I'd say, yes, and you're permanently dating the movie as such, rather than letting it be more timeless. Don't get me wrong here. I mean, Steve Vai and I became lifelong friends as a result of working together on this film. And we had such a blast that we often got thrown off the set for giggling too much. We still call each other the Mojo Men due to us cracking up during this one scene where Joe Seneca kept blowing the line, "This is the Mojo Bag." We'd laughed so hard they had to remove us from the premises. I just wanted the film to retain the authenticity it so needed. Walter Hill wanted the end to be more of a boxing match, as he put it, so I guess it had to be the blues version of The Karate Kid starring Ralph Macchio. I'm going to pause for a second and say Arlen Roth on his own website is a big-time offender of using way too many exclamation points at the end of his sentences. If I were to put the emphasis he wants me to on this, I'd be overloading the microphone right now. You know, get thrown off the set for giggling too much. This is the Mojo Bag. Remove us from the premises. Ralph Macchio. Like, that's how I would have to read it if I was going to go by his direction. So maybe he was a bit difficult to work with on the film. Maybe he was very controlling. I don't know. If his use of exclamation points is any indication, he might have been. This all disappointed Cooder. Ry Cooder. I know. Sorry. I'm a child. I grew up with Dukes of Hazzard. There was a character named Cooder. Crazy Cooder coming at you. This disappointed Cooder quite a bit too, as he was supposed to be on camera. He put on camera in quotes. This man needs to have the rights for typing things taken away from him. Jesus. On camera does not need to be put in inverted commas, sir, to use the King's English. For the part Vai eventually played in the film, the scene, so he's saying, they replaced Cooder with Vai. This scene originally opened also with Vai cutting down Shuggie Otis, one-time guitar phenom and son of the renowned LA blues band leader Johnny Otis. But after many days of shooting, it ended up on the cutting room floor because they said it was not politically correct to have a white guy beating a black guy. Hey, I thought he was supposed to be the devil! 3 exclamation points. I think that's actually a good point. That's worth the three punctuationals after it. Anyway, that was sad because it would have resurrected Shuggie's career. He and I did at least do a little Hot Licks audio project while I was there, and we had a great time together. We kept working on the film. I kept creating music for it, and Entertainment Tonight even did 2 special segments about my involvement with the movie. While in LA, we had a Crossroads versus the Terminator softball game that I won with a 3-run homer. One of the true highlights of making the film for me. Talk about the excess of filmmaking. They even created real uniforms for that one game. Meanwhile, things were starting to seem strange in Crossroads land. They still never signed my contract, even though I had now been working 5 months on the project. I was creating music and playing it all, fully expecting the proper credits. I'd get thrown out of recording studios when I was supposed to be there working on the guitar parts for Ralph. It all got kind of weird and secretive, and it seemed as if they were trying to keep something hidden from me. When the film finally came out, my songwriting and performance credits were not where they were promised to be, and it was really disheartening. Still, I got lots of mileage out of the film, lots of exposure, and Vai always mentioned in his interviews that I was the one who really created the guitar parts for the majority of the film. Bill Kanigeiser did all the classical playing throughout, and by the ending duel, we were all involved in that music. Me, Rai, Vai, and Bill, all part of the same guitar solos. I've still got the guitar from the film, along with many special other things they did with me, for me, such as a special Crossroads strap, etc. It was an amazing ride, and despite some of the negatives, such as the credits mess up, it was a personal and artistic experience I wouldn't trade for anything. Truly a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. Now to jump to some more quotes from Steve Vai from a Guitar World interview, or guitarworld.com features, /Steve-Vai-Crossroads. He says, I think people responded to Jack Butler because I was projecting so much intensity into the character. Kids respond to that kind of thing. Take a look at most video games, blockbuster movies, contemporary rock record releases, rock videos, etc. The majority of them are centered around sex and violence. Those elements light up the senses. It's a frightening proposal to look into the future and imagine the type of stimulating, psyche-manipulating sensory output we will be eating. But I also think there are many socially redeeming and uplifting things out there too. But back to Earth, I believe the music in Crossroads and the whole idea of the duel was energetic and well laid out. And kids responded to that too. I am not a part of the fast lane Hollywood scene, and I don't particularly desire to act, but I sure did have a good time doing that film. In a nutshell, I got a call from Ry Cooder. He asked me if I'd like to play on the soundtrack because they needed a hot rod guitar player for this guitar duel scene. I read the script, built a duel concept, and we recorded it. After the director Walter Hill had met me and heard the recording, he asked if I'd be interested in being in the film. I told him no at first, but then I read the script again and felt that a certain side of my personality could relate to the character of Jack Butler. Celluloid history. And it is noted also that his portrayal of Jack Butler is a bit of a nod to the written accounts of the sort of haggard, desperate, sweaty countenance of Paganini in life as well. He is doing a sort of physical tribute in more ways than one to Paganini, not just by playing music inspired by him, but portraying, the man himself who was rumored, just like Robert Johnson, to have sold his soul to the devil for his extraordinary playing ability. Now let's go back to a little bit of Vai and a little bit of Zappa in this next segment. Do you need to get up? Do you need to pull over to the side of the road and stretch your pants a bit? You can do that. Are you home? Do you need to get up and go to the kitchen? Get a seltzer? I like a good seltzer. Get me one. 2 dashes of Cholula in that, please. Thank you. No Cholula? Tapatio. No Tapatio? El Yucatan. No Yucatan? Improvise. I found an article on ultimateguitar.com that says Steve Vai explains how Frank Zappa modding Jimi Hendrix's burnt guitar encouraged him to design his signature Ibanez gem. That's a lot to unpack all at once, so let's do it. Obviously, some of this is going to retread on the ground that we've already, walked upon earlier in the episode, just like Dan and Brian talking about Shrapnel Records is a callback to things we've already discussed earlier in the episode. But I didn't know there was a direct gear connection to Frank Zappa when it comes to Frank owning a Jimi Hendrix guitar. And I found more information about that I will save for my Jimi Hendrix episode. Do you think I'm going to waste that on you here now? No, I will not. So while I found this on ultimateguitar.com, they're just pulling quotes from an interview with Music Radar, which is, that's journalism now. It's all journalism. Like mainstream journalism is just reporting what people said on Twitter. Oh, it's a wonderful world we live in. Vai talks about how he watched Frank Zappa mod the dickens out of a guitar that Jimi Hendrix had previously burned. And I believe it was given to him in Miami at the Miami Pop Festival, handed over to Zappa. It's not the Monterey Pop guitar, not the famous one, but it was burned by Hendrix. And this, watching this modification kind of encouraged Steve Vai to pursue some wackier designs of his own, gave him a more reckless attitude as far as what he needed to come up with when it came to solutions for his, guitar needs that at the time most folks would perceive as pretty sacrilegious, which is no joke. This is well before the vintage market gets established. This is well before the shred guitar boom. Obviously, this is before MTV. And MTV and fast guitar players with, wild hair and, spangly outfits leads to guitars being played on videos that are more visually arresting. It is not, the kind of thing that it's cool. It's not cool to show up with a coffee table looking guitar from the late 70s, which was totally reasonable in the arena tour era of, your Black Oak Arkansas or Blue Oyster Cults or other bands with 3 words in their name that never really made it to MTV because they're like, why would I spend money making a video? Why would I try to get noticed visually? I have a fan base. So the younger guys needed newer, sharper, shinier guitars in a eye-catching array of colors because of what Steve Vai ends up innovating after watching what Frank Zappa ends up innovating. Vai talks about, seeing various things going on. There's a part of me that looks into the world and sees what's available. Where is technology and how can it serve me? And what guitars are available and what can they do? And I remember early on thinking, this is a Stratocaster, okay. It's got a whammy bar, which is what I want. I don't like the way it sounds because it has single coils. Now there's the Les Paul. That's what I want. That's what Jimmy Page plays. It sounds great. It sounds rock and roll, but it doesn't have a whammy bar. It doesn't have enough frets. That doesn't sit well. Then I am working with Frank Zappa and watching what a free thinker he is, and he had no governor. When it came to taking a guitar that Jimi Hendrix burned at a concert that Frank got a hold of and then putting parametric EQs in it, it didn't matter whose guitar it was. It looked cool. So I decided at one point, and this was simple, innocent, low-hanging fruit, not having any intention of making something that anybody else would be interested in except myself. And what that was the gem, which is his signature Ibanez guitar. I looked around and went, what do I want? What's not here? I want 24 frets with double coil pickups. I want that. If it doesn't exist, I wanted to be able to reach those frets. That didn't exist. You can't reach them on a Strat or a Les Paul. They make these cutaways so you can't play comfortably up high. When you do things innocently, it's not like you feel you're being blasphemous. It's blasphemous to put a whammy bar on a Les Paul. Fuck you. I'll do what I want. I'm going to do what I want because it doesn't matter to anybody. See, that makes it easy. When it doesn't matter to anybody else but you, It's really easy. When asked about how Frank Zappa had modified Hendrix's Strat, he goes, yeah, he had these double-stacked parametric EQs and he put a Floyd Rose on it. You know, he took the pickups out. He changed the pickup covers that had stuff Hendrix used, the lighter fluid. It had pickup covers that had the holes from the lighter fluid. Take them out and change them. But Dweezil got it all back together. Frank didn't throw the shit out. From what I understand, it was a guitar that Jimmy burned in Miami. You know, when you're sitting there thinking that I need a typo. It says thinking that you are doing doesn't matter to anybody. Thinking that what you're doing, I assume is the sentence, doesn't matter to anybody. Musicradar.com and or ultimateguitar.com editors. I designed my gem to my little idiosyncrasies, and when I started playing it, I thought, yes, this is it. This is the guitar. It's perfect. It is perfect for me. And it didn't exist in the world. Obviously, until Vai made it happen at that time. That's what is implied. I love that.
So the thing that also happened post sort of Jeff Beck. So you get the fusion, and then you get sort of Jeff Beck having this big hit with I don't remember which one. Wired Blow by Blow.
Highway Jam.
Highway Jam.
Yeah. And then, but you also have Frampton Comes Alive, which is kind of a guitar centered, hit record.
Yeah.
Like he's playing he's killing it on that record.
And the talk box.
And the talk box.
The talk box, Do You Feel Like I Do? I mean, that blew people's minds.
But he's also like he's kind of shredding. Like Frampton's kind of killing it on that record.
He's a great guitar player.
And so you set that up for like this like admiration of guitar players, and then you have Eddie Van Halen, who's obviously 78, right? That comes out, Eruption happens, and people lose their fucking mind, and nobody knows what's happening. And it's for some reason, guitar is important.
Sure,
that's what happens.
Driving.
Yeah,
and also the technology and what it can do after Hendrix is like a big deal. Like, how much more gain can you get out of like different kinds of equipment, and then how does that create sustain?
Yes.
And where does here's a curveball. Where does Frank Marino sit with all this? Is he a factor at all?
For sure. I mean, monster player.
Yeah,
monster
Rush.
player. And
because you said Frampton Comes Alive, which made me think about Wayne's World.
Right.
And he's like, yeah, everyone in the world had Frampton Comes Alive. If you lived in the suburbs, it came in the mail with packets of Tide. But then later he gets broken up with by Tia Carrere, and he's like, I feel like I've been thrown down in the bargain bin of life next to Mahogany Rush album.
Such a Des.
Right.
Like such
an underhanded diss.
Yeah.
And
this is just the unnecessary.
And I've known Dan I've known Dan closely for 12 years, and I ask him this question at least once a year. What is the band that backs up Tia Carrere in that movie? It's somebody else's.
It's Keel. It's like parts of Keel.
I keep
it's
thinking
Mark Ferrari.
It's Slaughter, but it's not Slaughter.
And I think it might be Dana Strum, but I think it's Blas
definitely
Elias.
Dana Strum. Come on now.
I think it's
It
Blas
has
Elias.
to be Dana Strum.
Yeah, I think Dana Strum is the core of everything. But I think it's Blas Elias,
the key
Dana
to all
Strum, and
this.
Mark Ferrari. I think.
If we get Dana Strum working, then it'll be good. He's the key to all this.
For sure. So, what was it? Frampton Comes Alive. That was what I was going to mention.
Yeah.
So every time I'd ever heard Frampton Comes Alive, I had in my brain huge arena, dark stage lights. That was my brain. Do you know it was in the middle of the day outside with broad daylight?
No.
Yeah, Frampton Comes Alive is actually a show. I don't know where. I can't remember where it was recorded.
But
it's an outdoor concert.
It's
like
the
a
cover, right? Because it looks like he's in the dark. It looks like he's in the dark.
Right, but it was an outdoor festival in broad daylight.
No kidding.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and like there is footage of it. Like
Yes,
I'm
of
sure
course.
there's all over YouTube and
Sure.
shit. But like that was my mental picture of what that was completely not what it was,
Sure.
and it was just destroyed when I found that out. It's like
There's
God
a
damn
good-
it.
There's a good for anyone that wants to look it up if you can. The Time Life Rock and Roll History, the '70s episode or the Guitar Heroes episode in the '70s. It shows him playing a stadium, and that being this like big huge moment. Like you hear the newscaster's voice, like a lot of young people have gathered together to watch a young man whom they admire very much. His name is Peter Frampton, and there he is. in a stadium. So like, woke up this morning with a wine glass in my hand and whatever. And then it like voiceovers. And then that's the only reason I've even heard the first part of that song.
Right
on.
I've heard.
Do you have a talk box like I do?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Richie Sambora's answer was yes.
Yes. So that's the.
Yes, and then he was an asshole about it and got fired from Bon Jovi. It was great.
So there you go. So yes, it starts with Peter Frampton, then it goes to Richie Sambora for You Give Love a Bad Name, and then it goes to Jerry Cantrell for Man in the Box, and every piece of shit wannabe middle-aged guy in suburbia from that point on out would just turn his Dunlop Crybaby on and play the wrong chord on that song. He just played E5 chord. You go bow, yow, 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 and it's like, well, no, it's a talk box and it's a D with a low E root. It's not
E over D.
It's not E5.
Yeah.
It's E over D.
Fuck you.
Yeah.
So sorry, I had to bring us to not even the present. 35 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and everyone, and while we're ranting about that song, no one plays the fucking bass part in that, right? In the little pre-chorus part, which always gets on my dick. But dun 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 dun, the little chromatic thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. No one ever plays that, right?
Nobody ever does.
It pisses me off.
I'm going back through the story of Alice in Chains right now, and it's really sad to find out how insecure Mike Starr was.
Raspberry.
Because he was basically like he had a friend in the studio when they made oh, you bastard.
Yeah.
And when they made Dirt, he was pretty fucked up, and he had just a good friend in him teaching him how to play bass for some of the songs.
Well, Evan Seeley, who was one of the owners of Bass Northwest, they flew him down to L.A.
You're about to tell me he's the guy that I'm talking about.
When they were recording Facelift, because he wanted Evan to get his bass tone for him.
Ooh.
So Evan flew down to L.A. to the studio where they were recording Facelift because he knew Evan from like probably the Seattle Music Days. I'm sure it was Seattle Music Days, and he's like, Evan will know how to get my bass tone right and make it sound good. And so Evan told me this story like forever ago, probably 20 years ago at this point, that he flew down and was in the studio for a day, and all he did was just turn knobs on his SVT2, I think is what he used for that, and got his bass tone dialed in. So it's
Damn.
Flew home.
And then flew home. Yeah, it's like an SVT2 and his Spectre NS2, and that's that sound.
Wow, man. I think this is a pretty good place to stop for today. As I said, this was intended to be one long big piece, and then it got up to like somewhere between 6 and 7 hours. I went back and did a lot of editing and changing around some of my initial ideas and my lead-ins and my sort of bumpers and transitions just today, the stuff that I recorded like over a month ago. So I apologize if there's anything that continuity-wise didn't make sense. If there is, I completely missed it. But I think I managed to get rid of all the parts where I'm like, we come to an end of the conversation bit, and I'm like, haha, Dan, you'll wait on that thought, and we'll get back to it in a minute. I had a bunch of that kind of stuff that I had to get rid of because I ended up shifting around the order of things, the guitar magazine segments and the talk about the movie. Now, next episode, more talk about the movie, especially the guitar duel at the end. There's a lot of in-depth stuff I found out about just a few days ago. I was already over the limit of what I thought I was going to do, and it's very exciting. We're going to get into the history of Kramer guitars, DiMarzio, Ibanez. We're going to talk fun times with Joe Satriani and Steve Vai together, goofing off, talking about old gear and things. I'm so jazzed about this, and I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy you listened this whole way through, and you got to hear my cool friends talk. I have a feeling that people are just going to want them to be on all the episodes from here on out. And I don't blame you. If you're here for the first time, thank you for digging into it. Thank you for absorbing the information and all my guitar demos that I recorded in my living room that I've been too lazy to put into songs and make people at rehearsal try to learn how to play. If nothing else, I have this. It takes the pressure off having to have a finished song just to get this idea out of my head while I'm watching action movies in my living room and, throwing them down on a Zoom recorder. 2 things you don't need right now, hopefully, but may in the future. National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255. And RAIN, the National Sexual Assault Hotline, 1-800-656-4673. Obviously, when you need those, you're not going to come fast forward to the end of one of my podcasts, but I want those in your head. I want you to remember they're there. When a time of crisis comes, you can obviously Google them. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Sleep well. Sleep the sleep of the just, because you gave a damn about rock and roll and the history of it and movies. I think rock and roll is wonderful and rock and roll is the best. And I think you are too.